The Senate Governmental Affairs Committee yesterday held a hearing on legislation that would establish a Department of National Homeland Security. Members heard testimony from White House Budget Director Mitch Daniels and Warren Rudman of the U.S. Commission on National Security, among others. Connecticut Senator Joseph Lieberman chairs this 3-hour, 10-minute hearing.
Hearing will come to order. Good morning, and thanks to all of you, including, of course, my colleagues from the Senate and the House for being here today. This Governmental Affairs Committee hearing will consider legislation introduced by Senator Specter, Senator Graham, and myself to organize the federal government so that it can better prevent, effectively prepare for, and quickly respond to terrorist acts made against American citizens on American territory. This is a follow-up to 2 hearings we held last fall on whether the government and specifically the executive branch is adequately organized to meet the type of security threats we must unfortunately expect after September 11th. Given President Bush's decision last fall to establish an Office of Homeland Security and appoint former Governor Tom Ridge to head it, it seems to me that it's clear that proper structures and mechanisms were not in place on September 11th to adequately protect our homeland, and the President's action since then makes that clear. But today, we've got to ask, 6 months after Governor Ridge's appointment, whether we're adequately positioned to defend ourselves against another terrorist attack within our borders. Are the gaps in our security policies closing? Are dozens of agencies with a role in protecting the American people against terrorism better coordinating their activities? Has duplication of efforts diminished? Governor Ridge, I am confident, has done everything within his power to make this nation safer. For example, he's helped to boost the administration's Homeland Security budget, and he's implemented a new warning system. But from my point of view, this is not enough. And the reason is that Governor Ridge and the office he heads lack the necessary authority to overcome the bureaucratic obstacles that always get in the way of major change in how the government conducts its business. I will say also in this regard that the administration's refusal to allow Governor Ridge to testify publicly before this and other congressional committees on his activities makes our work this morning more difficult than it should be. And incidentally, we did request Governor Ridge's appearance here and got the same kind of letter that Senator Byrd and Senator Stevens got. The governor is on the House side today, although speaking behind closed doors with the Government Reform Committee. But given the effect his work has on the lives of every man, woman, and child living within our borders, it seems to me that Governor Ridge needs to work with Congress in public in the way government officials with the authority he has have been doing for decades, indeed for centuries, which is to come before a public hearing and testify and have a transcript available for congressional and public review, to describe what he's doing, to flesh out his successes, to speak to his difficulties, in short, to be accountable. And he must do this from a position of strength and authority. America's war against terrorism cannot be allowed to get mired in domestic wars over bureaucratic turf. So the bottom line, as I see it, is that if statutory and budget authority are not conferred upon the Director of Homeland Security, the homeland defense of this nation will be less than it must be. Governor Ridge and his successors need to centralize their authority so our anti-terrorism policies are clear, consistent, and comprehensive. They need the power, frankly, to knock heads, to overcome bureaucratic resistance, to eliminate wasteful duplication of effort, and to target precious resources. And they need control over the budgets of agencies they're charged with overseeing, so those agencies will do what the director concludes in the national interest needs to be done. Together, that kind of authority will give the new agency the muscle necessary to compete with thousands of other demands for public money and attention. Last October, Senator Specter and I introduced legislation to establish such a cabinet-level Department of National Homeland Security led by a presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed secretary who would be a member of the National Security Council, accountable not just to the president, but to Congress and to the public. We recognize that no matter how robust a department of this kind may be, it will not include every agency that plays a role in Homeland Security. But the bill we will discuss today does contain a number of improvements over our earlier version. The most significant changes are a requirement for a national strategy to combat terrorism and the establishment of a White House office to coordinate that strategy as originally proposed by our colleague Senator Bob Graham of Florida. These key improvements underscore the seriousness with which we regard the job of protecting the American public, and they speak to the public's desire, indeed the public's need for the best protection we can provide them. On an operational level, these improvements also allow for the government to coordinate anti-terrorism activities of the military and intelligence communities, which would be beyond the purview of the cabinet-level department that we are talking about. With this combined approach, I think we address the need to permanently restructure Homeland Security functions under a cabinet-level secretary who has operational authority and the ability to personally direct a government-wide plan. At the same time, we provide for the level of a coordination with other federal agencies and budget certification authority that can most effectively be implemented from the White House. Now, the formation of a Department of Homeland Security obviously requires a major restructuring of the federal government's public safety-related responsibilities. I know this will not be easy. History tells us that. There will be resistance. And it seems somehow appropriate, I hope no one takes offense, that I quote Machiavelli here, who said, Senator Rudman, it's just coincidental that I raised my head when I mentioned Machiavelli, and I said, because you carry some of his wisdom. But anyway, he once said, there is nothing more difficult to plan, more doubtful of success, nor more dangerous to manage than the creation of a new system. And so it is. But a restructuring of the kind we envision here is now critically necessary. In fact, in previous periods of crisis, such as the one we're in now, we have undertaken bold organizational change. I think of General Marshall's transformation of the Army, which helped win World War II, or the National Security Act of 1947 that created the CIA and the Department of Defense at the outset of the Cold War, and more recently the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 in streamlining the military command helped us to prosecute the Persian Gulf War and so much else we've done militarily in the 90s, since the 90s. We need such a change now to help us fight and win the war against terrorism at home and abroad. I thank the distinguished group of witnesses who will come before us today, and I look very much to their help and their testimony. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I suppose we know now when you get that question about who's your favorite political philosopher, we know what the answer will be.
Well, usually I say it's either Machiavelli or Fred Thompson.
The hearing today is an important one, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your leadership in this area, one that is a concern to all of us, as well as the leadership of our panelists today, all of whom have made substantial contributions toward trying to address the leading problem facing our country today. Just to frame the issues a little bit as I see it, it looks to me like we're going to address the question of whether or not essentially we need a new entity of some kind, a new lead entity as opposed to a coordinating function. And frankly, I think there can be cases made on both sides. I think a new entity such as you suggest makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. But as you pointed out, there are going to be some very important terrorist fighting entities that will not be under this umbrella. and what we do with justice and the CIA and the FBI and all of that, and is a big question. And I think that's why it should be understandable the administration is taking some time to come with its own plan. As I understand it, its strategic plan is going to be forthcoming this summer sometime. But I'm reminded, I think, General McCaffrey, when he was here testifying some months ago, he said, I forget the number of years he used now, but he said it would be several years, as I recall, in his opinion, before we had a good feel on exactly what we needed and which direction that we needed to go in, and suggested we be careful as we proceed and not assume that we have the answers to all these questions. I think today will help us get a better understanding of what those answers are. We're also faced with the question of whether or not it ought to be statutory. I think the administration has and will make its case today with regard to that issue. I must say that it appears that the job that Governor Ridge has is turning into more of an operational one, and certainly more of a public one than some of the other entities, comparable entities such as the NSC, that's being used sometimes to draw comparison. Separate question is reorganization and consolidation and integration of the various agencies. As we know, we have, 40, 50 agencies now involved. I think most people realize that we can't continue on with, Customs being in Treasury, INS being in Justice, the Coast Guard being in Transportation, and all that. But it is extremely difficult to make modest changes and get them through Congress when jurisdiction is involved. And we in Congress have not much to be proud about in terms of our own situation. We have 10 committees now involved in trying to so-called oversee this issue. How do we expect this to all come about smoothly when we've got that kind of situation? We've got jurisdictional anomalies, out our ears. The Banking Committee now has Export Administration Authority. The consideration of dual-use items that can be used for military purposes in the Banking Committee. About the only committee that doesn't have national security implications has got that particular piece. So we've got a lot of work to do on our side also. And it occurs to me there will be that reorganization is essentially a congressional problem, that we can reorganize. The president can't do this by executive order if he wanted to. We must be the ones that do it. If it's done, it's a challenge before us, but nothing is going to get done unless we have strong presidential leadership. I think it's going to take everybody pulling together to make even modest changes in terms of reorganization, a massive job, and probably much more of an important one than the particular title we give the person who brings all this together. It occurs to me that how we change this setup, if we change it, when we change it, is very important. But unfortunately, like so many other areas, presidential leadership is the vital part of any change that we make. Without it, doesn't matter what we do. With it, it almost doesn't matter what we do, quite frankly. It's right there at his doorstep, and he's going to have to provide the leadership and take the responsibility and have the accountability. And I think he's doing that. And can it be done in a better way? Perhaps. But I think we need to face up to the fact that to have any changes, we're going to have to work together with the White House to get them done. And to have any real results, we're going to have to do the same thing. And under the president's leadership, I have been of the mind that we should keep open minds about how we should proceed and what we need to wind up with ultimately. I still feel that way. The national strategy is due, I believe, in July. I'd like to see what the administration comes up with. I believe that because the job is so important, is so complex, as General McCaffrey pointed out, that we need to give the administration a fair shot at coming forth with how they feel it ought to be done, and see how that flies and what it looks like, and to the extent we can, see how it's working before we launch off into anything that would be extremely specific in the reorganizing or the reshuffling of the boxes. I'm still of that mind, but I definitely think that we've got to continue to take a look at this as we go along, because just as we don't have all the answers, the administration should acknowledge that it doesn't necessarily have all the answers either. And we just need to continue down this road together, and I think that this hearing today is a good first step in that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Thompson. I agree totally with you that this is only going to get done if Congress is working together with the White House. We start out in from different positions. This is not a partisan matter, as the range of our colleagues before us indicates very clearly. I think, as maybe Senator Redmond said earlier on in one of our discussions, that the time will show the necessity of coordination in this critical governmental function. In fact, in some ways it's already happening. In some ways it's already begun with some recommendations Governor Ridgett's made. But of course I feel the sooner the better, and hopefully we can work together to make that happen. Senator Collins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your holding this hearing to evaluate legislative options to strengthen our homeland security. It is my judgment that we do need to have a statutory basis for the office to clarify the lines of authority, and I'm very interested in the legislation, not only the legislation that you and Senator Specter have introduced, but also the other proposals before us, and in particular the legislation that Senator Graham has introduced. I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses on the best way to strike the appropriate balance to assure that the Director of Homeland Security has adequate authority, budget resources, and the clear authority to accomplish this overwhelmingly important mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Collins. Senator Voinovich.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you for holding this hearing to discuss establishing a Department of Homeland Security and a national office for combating terrorism. I'd also like to thank our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Chairman, it's clear to me that our country must examine the organization of our federal government from a new perspective following September the 11th. We must make certain that the nation has effective, accountable organizations and systems in place to protect Americans from future terrorist attacks. We begin this effort in the immediate aftermath of the attacks, and I believe it is productive that we continue these discussions today. We had a hearing, 5 or 6 months ago on the same subject. Recently, FEMA Director Joe Albaugh appeared before the Environment and Public Works Committee to discuss the President's budget for the First Responder Initiative, which he is going to be charged with. I mentioned to him that I was worried about some of the news relayed to me by local officials in Dayton who were part of a first responder team who were at ground zero, who were unable to get information about the environmental hazards that they encountered there, and also the fact that they were unable to get the paperwork that they needed to make application to take advantage of the Federal Workers' Compensation Program. The issue today before us is how do we best solve problems? And there have been serious discussions about making long overdue improvements in our governmental institutions across the country, from the White House and so forth. The point I'm making here, Mr. Chairman, is we need to understand that there's a lot of challenges that we have out there, and we're talking about a new agency and we're talking about coordination. But the fact of the matter is that the agencies that are charged with the responsibility to get the job don't have the personnel and the quality of people to do that job. And I think that has got to be something that we need to concentrate our attention on. Washington Post talked about the Immigration and Naturalization Service, 2,000 agents to enforce the immigration laws on our border. I mentioned Joe Albaugh and FEMA. I asked him about the condition of his workforce, and I think his response is indicative of a widespread problem in the federal government. He said, and I think this is really important, I have been in this position about a year, and it was clear to me right up front that we have not been spending enough time internally on employees. Retention was a problem, and there was essentially no recruitment. I think over the next 18 months, somewhere between 45% and 45% of our agency is eligible for retirement. That is just a lot of gray matter to be walking out the door. Since 9/11, the retirements have accelerated. People have come to my office with a different perspective on life, which I cannot fault them for, wanting to spend more time with their kids, grandkids, their spouses. FEMA suffers from its own successes in that if you want a job done, you give it to FEMA. And oftentimes we are given tasks to perform, but not necessarily the resources to complete the task. So as a result, many of our people in not only the Washington headquarters, but in our 10 regional offices wear 2, 3, 4, and 5 hats at the same time. And I think it puts an inordinate amount of stress on those individuals, on their families, who I think make the ultimate sacrifices because those individuals are kept away from home more than necessary. So what I'm saying, Mr. Chairman, is that I think improving the federal government's strategic management of human capital is the most important action we can take to better prepare our nation against threats to our national and homeland security. And it's critical that we address this problem as we consider legislation before the committee today. You can coordinate all you want to, but if the agencies you're coordinating haven't got the personnel and the people to get the job done, you're not going to be able to get the job done. And I think too often we concentrate on form and procedure and the rest of it and neglect the most important thing that we need to have in the federal government, and that is people. You win with people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Voinovich, right on. I'm very grateful for the presence of this group of members of both chambers, both parties here today, who've been involved in this, and we look forward to your testimony. I think Senator Specter has engaged me to go to. I think he's also, if I'm looking for an excuse to call on him first, he's clearly the most senior member before the committee, so I would call on Senator Specter now.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Excuse me. Senator Cocker, do you have an opening statement? You snuck in behind me quickly.
I'll do it after.
Okay, fine. Go ahead, Senator Specter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Appropriations Committee is in the midst of 2 days of hearings on Homeland Security, and I'm due there shortly, so I appreciate your calling on me at this time. I believe that it is very important for this committee to move as promptly as possible to structure a bill. The hearing on Senate Bill 1534 was on October 12th, and this is a matter of considerable urgency. I think that Senator Thompson is correct that there has to be input from the White House. It has to be an agreed upon format, but I believe that is likely to come once the legislative process moves forward. I served on this committee for 4 years, and I know its capability to take the legislation which has been introduced in a variety of sources and to mold it into a bill. And when that starts to happen, there's going to be input from the White House. But I think we have no time to spare to do everything we can to structure Homeland Security in the most effective way possible. I'm glad to see Senator Graham's addition to the bill on intelligence czar. I know from my service as chairman of the Intelligence Committee in the 104th Congress that there needs to be a revision in intelligence gathering and reporting. I'm glad to hear the reference to Machiavelli, Mr. Chairman. Glad to see one more co-sponsor on the list. Should materially improve chances. When you said Senator Thompson and Machiavelli were your two favorite political philosophers, I expected Senator Thompson to reply, didn't see much difference. in making alternative
I'm sorry I brought this up.
alternative choices. The job which Governor Ridge faces is a very daunting responsibility, and he is a man of terrific ability, which I know, having worked with him very closely for more than 2 decades, 12 years in the House and 6.5 years as governor. And when he says that he can walk down the hall and get matters resolved with the president, and no one will say no to the president, I agree no one's going to say no to the president. But it's pretty hard to walk down the hall every time there is a controversy. And we're talking about an institution. And it may be that the next director of Homeland Security will not have the very close relationship which Governor Ridge enjoys with the president. We are now seeing a battle of separation of powers with the position taken by the administration on having Governor Ridge not testify before the Congress. And I believe that that would be obviated if the Congress acts to create a cabinet level position. Then there would be no doubt about it. My own view is that when you have as much responsibility as the Director of Homeland Security has, and you have a say on $37 billion, that you really have a de facto cabinet officer. This is not like the National Security Counselor, who was created by statute and by congressional enactment in 1947, put aside, so that the analogy to Dr. Condoleezza Rice, I think, is not apt. And the sooner we move on to have a structure here, I think the better off we will be. My yellow light is on, and you have a long list of witnesses, and I'm going to observe the time meticulously. But in closing, I would emphasize the need, I think, for early action. 9/11 has had its 6-month anniversary. Senate Bill 1534, which you and I introduced months ago, had a hearing on October 12th. In my view, the sooner this committee acts, the sooner we will get the ball rolling, and I think we can work out an accommodation with the White House. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Specter. I agree with you, and as soon as we feel we can bring it to markup, we will, and I hope that's real soon. Senator Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, appreciate your holding this hearing on an important topic, and I believe that this is the time to begin serious consideration of the role of Congress in the Office of Homeland Security. As you know, much of this bill that's before us today is a product of legislation that was introduced in the fall of last year. We were asked by the President to defer pursuing that legislation in order to allow Governor Ridge to gain control of his responsibilities and to deal with some of the immediate issues that were facing him after September the 11th. Now 6 months plus have passed. I think it is time to begin the process of looking to the future for this important initiative. The legislation which, with Senator Feinstein and others, I introduced last fall was S. 1449, and in substantial part it has now been incorporated as Title II in the legislation that is before us. This legislation has as its purpose to institutionalize the Office of Homeland Security and assure its accountability to the American people. To do that, the legislation would provide that the director of the office would be appointed by the President with the advice and consent of the Senate. The director would develop a national strategy for the prevention and response to terrorism. The director would be required to certify all portions of the federal budget relating to terrorism. Last November, with Paul Light, the director of governmental studies at the Brookings Institute, I co-authored an op-ed in the Washington Post in which we set out 7 benchmarks against which the American people and the members of Congress could measure the effectiveness of the current executive order Office of Homeland Security and help us to determine if a more formal statutory authority was warranted. I'd like to use my remaining time just to briefly comment on those benchmark standards in hope that they might be helpful to this committee as it attempts to answer that question. The benchmarks that we identified were first, that Governor Ridge needs to be first in line for information. This is particularly true as it relates to sensitive intelligence information that would require action which had as its objective to avoid a terrorist attack. We do not want to be in the position of constantly picking up the pieces after an assault, but rather to be able to avoid attacks against our people. Number 2, Governor Ridge needs to have access to the principals who will make the operational decision for the appropriate agencies, and he needs to have that access on a timely basis. Number 3, Governor Ridge needs to be a gatekeeper in the budget and personnel processes. 4, Governor Ridge needs a permanent staff that owes its loyalty to him and to him alone. This recognizes the fact that there are inevitably going to be conflicts between this Office of Homeland Security and the line agencies which have parts of the responsibility for implementing the plan against terrorism. Governor Ridge, number 5, needs a staff which is close to him, and that is not only close in terms of its loyalty, but in terms of its physical proximity. 6, Governor Ridge needs a say in the selection of appointees at the agencies which will have significant responsibility for anti-terrorism and response to terrorism. And finally, number 7, Governor Ridge needs to be involved in all management reviews of the Homeland Defense establishment. 6 months after listing these criteria, Mr. Light and I would define the results as being mixed in terms of how well the operation of the office stands up against these criteria. He clearly has access to the information needed to do his job, but much of the information is still muddy, its sources diverse, and its usefulness often mixed. Evidence of this is the color-coded system of vague threat warnings which the office has developed. Governor Ridge also enjoys access to key decision makers from the President to the Vice President, the Attorney General, which was our second criterion. But what he has not had, at least not yet, it appears, is success in making his case on the need for the kinds of changes that will be necessary to give America an organized Homeland Security presence. He appears to have had his greatest success in the budget and personnel process, our third criteria. But the governor has continued to argue against making his case even for this area of success before the Congress. And he has said that he has no power to spend, obligate, or audit money, and for that reason has no obligation to come before the Congress. As for his staff, executive office space, and role in selecting key presidential appointees, again, mixed success. He is still running a minimalist operation, still looking for office space which is proximate to his own space in the old executive office building. And it is not clear that he's had a role in selecting key personnel. As an example, 2 appointments were announced recently, the nominee to be the Surgeon General and the Director of the Institute of Health. Both of these will be essential players in the fight against bioterrorism. Governor Ridge does not appear to have had much to say over the operations and management of the Homeland Security establishment, which was our 7th and final criterion. As the recent events in the INS suggest, Homeland Security continues to depend on agencies that are properly structured, staffed, and led, and when those criteria are not present, then we expose ourselves to the kind of tragedies that occurred on September the 11th. So, Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask that the balance of my statement be printed in the record as if read. I applaud the President and Governor Ridge for the progress that they have made, particularly under extremely challenging, difficult circumstances. I do not believe that what we are about here is a clash between the executive and the legislative. What we are trying to do is to provide to the American people what they have every right to expect their national government to do. If you read the first lines of the Constitution, it clearly outlines that protecting the homeland is one of the fundamental reasons that this government was established. That is the importance of the business that we are about today, and I commend you for doing so.
Thanks, Senator Graham. That was very helpful testimony, and thanks so much for working with us to bring our two approaches to this together. It's an honor to be working with you.
Thank you.
Senator Gregg, thanks for being here this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here. Also, I'm also participating in this Appropriations Committee hearing on Homeland Security, which is going on. I think it's appropriate to raise that, not only because Senator Specter headed off to it, and I'll be heading off to it soon, but because the first witness, major witness called to that committee by Senator Byrd was a professor of government from Pennsylvania. I believe his name was Glover. And his basic theorem was that centralizing the decision process in a Homeland Security office at the White House at a cabinet level was probably not the best approach to take, interestingly enough. And the reasons he pointed out were the same as raised as concerns by Senator Thompson, which are that the centers for excellence in our government for addressing terrorism are already pretty well established in agencies which have an line of authority which is never going to be able to be pulled into a central cabinet level position, specifically the FBI, the CIA, State Department, and Department of Defense and Justice. And I'm not sure I'm fully attracted to that idea. I do think that there is a role for an individual who has the authority of the Homeland Security portfolio. But the question becomes, what should that authority be, and what should that individual's role be? I've spent a fair amount of time on this issue, and in fact, as chairman of the Commerce State Justice Committee for the last 4 years prior to the changeover, I held a number of hearings on this specific issue, which was the interrelationship of the different departments, and came to the conclusion that we do need some sort of reorganization to put structure into what we're doing. But rather than going the full step of creating a cabinet level position which tries to pull in Homeland Security but cannot accomplish it fully because of some of the players simply will not be pulled in, such as the FBI and the Justice Department, State Department, CIA, and Defense, my suggestion is that we take a lesser step, but one which would produce an efficient response to a known problem, and that is our borders. Probably no element of this entire exercise has less effective coordination now than the management of our borders in the area of protecting ourselves from terrorist actions. We have seen consistently breakdowns in the INS and the Border Patrol. We have seen overlapping responsibility and ineffectiveness from Customs, INS trying to work together. We know that agencies such as the agricultural quarantine efforts and the Coast Guard, which have huge responsibility in this area, are not being coordinated in a systematic manner with the other agencies such as Border Patrol. So I would like to suggest that rather than pursuing the course that is maybe the full effort, which has reservations to it, which have been outlined, that we take a look at resolving a problem that we know we can resolve, which is to take all the different Border Patrol elements of our government and put them into one agency, and then give that cabinet status. Specifically, I propose this in a bill, S-2020, which takes the elements of INS, which include Border Patrol and visa activity and immigration activity, elements of the full element of the Coast Guard, the elements of the DEA, which are covered by the Border Patrol, elements of the Agriculture Department, which are covered by, which involve making sure that foods coming into our country are safe. Put them under one management structure and under one leadership coming out of the administration, which would have a cabinet level status. I believe the practical effect of this approach would be that at least in one part of the question of how we protect our nation, which is determining who's coming into the country and what they're doing when they're in the country, what products are coming into the country, and what sort of threat is coming as a result of those products, at least in that one specific element, we would have structure and we would have coordination and we would have a responsible approach. Today we don't have that. Unfortunately, our borders are porous, our management of those borders is inefficient, and the lines of authority are overlapping and confusing. So I would like to suggest that this committee take a look at as it proceeds down the roll of looking at your broader bill here, which I'm sure you're going to want to mark up and report out, that I would like to suggest it as a parallel effort. You consider taking a look at marking up a bill which would resolve the issue of our borders and managing the people and managing the issue of who's coming into our country and what's coming into our country. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Senator Gregg, for a thoughtful statement. And I promise you we will consider that. It obviously omits some agencies that we're bringing into the larger proposal, but it's a very serious proposal that you're making, and it touches an area of critical need and relationship to the problem of Homeland Security. So I look forward to working with you on it. Thanks for your time. Welcome three colleagues, distinguished bipartisan group from the House. Thank you for being here, and thank you for working along with us. Obviously, not only do we have to work with the White House to get this done, we got to work with the House to get it done. Congresswoman Jane Harman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to be back testifying before your committee. Hello to members. I have a formal statement for the record and hope I can submit it and just summarize in 6 quick points, because many good points have already been made and I'm sure you don't need to hear them again. First point, I doubt that even Machiavelli could overcome the turf disputes in the executive branch and in Congress. With all of his skills, I still think they might even defeat him. In the current language, I have been saying that turf disputes have become aerosolized, and you inhale them and you die. And poor Ridge, I think, is on life support because his office is inadequately funded and has inadequate tools to do the job that we all need him to do. Second point, I believe that your new legislative thrust that we're discussing today, the combination of 2 ideas, combines the best bipartisan ideas that we've been able to come up with in the House and in the Senate. And I know that the 3 of us over here from the lower body have worked together, are prepared to work together, and eagerly want to work with you to fashion the best possible legislation and introduce a companion bill in the House at the same time that you introduce this bill, so that hopefully that will expedite its consideration in both bodies and its becoming law, because I do think we need a statute to settle these issues. Third point, this is the issue, not whether Ridge should testify. I think that's a sideshow. I think the main show is who is responsible for developing and taking and explaining the $38 billion Homeland Security budget. Whose strategy is it? Who can explain to Congress why we should authorize and appropriate that money? That's what the issue is. We shouldn't be authorizing and appropriating money that isn't justified by the executive branch. And somebody needs to come up here and explain that. And my candidate for that would be Ridge, but Ridge with a real day job. Fourth point, and I'm surprised this wasn't mentioned yet, but I think it is the touchstone and we should keep focused on it, and that is, certainly those of us who serve on the intelligence committees know this, and I know you know it as well. Our country is still vulnerable to a second wave of major terrorist attacks. We are still vulnerable. Even though we've had considerable success in Afghanistan and around the world in rounding up terrorists, we are still vulnerable. Everybody understands that there are sleeper cells with Al-Qaeda members and followers in the United States, Canada, Europe, and so forth. We are still vulnerable. There is no more time left before we come up with an adequate, focused Homeland Security strategy. And it is, as everyone has pointed out, already 6 months since September 11. It's almost 6 months since your first hearing of October 12 on this issue. Fifth point, I would just like to draw your attention to the chart over here. This chart was put together by the subcommittee on which I'm ranking member, the House Intelligence Subcommittee on Terrorism and Homeland Security. It is the chart that Tom Ridge held up as his organization chart when he took office. I would call that the Where's Waldo chart. Waldo is the Office of Homeland Security near the top, but I bet you can barely see it. And the blue lines are around the most major players in the executive branch, but there are 100 little boxes on this chart. This is the current organization or the current disorganization that the Director of Homeland Security is supervising. And even if we reorganize our border agencies, which I support, that just takes a few boxes out of here. There's still the rest of it. So I would argue, and I'm not sure whether I'm agreeing with Senator Gregg or not. I was not quite sure what his view is, but I think I agree with everyone else up here, that while we need to reorganize our border capacity, we also need, at minimum, an architect or orchestra conductor for the rest of it. And so I think the combination of a bigger, better border agency, FEMA, consequence management capacity is good, but then look at this chart. We need the rest. And so combining these functions, I think, is critical. Final point, my candidate for orchestra conductor is Tom Ridge. I think he brings the right skills. The problem is he has the wrong tools. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congresswoman Harman. Excellent statement and very helpful. I want to ask my two colleagues for their indulgence. I missed calling on Senator Kaka. He now has to leave soon. I want to ask him if he'd like to give his opening statement now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the patience of our witnesses. I again want to thank you for calling this hearing and thank our witnesses for their testimonies. Homeland Security presents challenges to our country in different ways. Our commitment in both national security and civil liberties is tested as we work to develop solutions that not only make a stronger, safer America, but a better one. We need to determine how we can best prevent, protect, and respond to threats on the homeland while preserving the freedoms that define America. The legislation we're reviewing this morning raises for me several important issues. Whatever strategy we undertake must maximize the talents of those charged with Homeland Security, as well as provide sufficient resources to address the threat. There are members on this committee who have been addressing this. I recently chaired a Federal Service Subcommittee hearing where representatives across government testified that their agencies need more people with critical skills in math, science, and foreign languages. Senators Durbin, Senator Thompson, and I have introduced the Homeland Security Federal Workforce Act, S. 1800, and the Homeland Security Education Act, S. 1799, to ensure that agencies have the critical people with the critical skills to guide the federal agencies in their national security missions in the long term. Senator Voinovich and I also have been working on this. Nor should union representation be a litmus test for patriotism of federal workers. The administration has already set a precedent by eliminating certain Title V rights for federal workers in national security positions. And so I'm disappointed by the administration's recent action, barring union representation for some 500 clerical and support employees at the Department of Justice. We should avoid the unintended consequences of a further erosion of Title V rights, including collective bargaining arrangements for federal employees. Federal employees are prohibited now by statute from striking, and their right to union representation does not constitute a national security risk. Union members are no less loyal than other members and Americans to their country. What the attacks of 9/11 demonstrated is that we are all soldiers in the war against terrorism. Moreover, we need to be certain that government has enough of the right people and resources to carry out new Homeland Security missions. The mission and responsibilities of the proposed Department for National Homeland Security is greater than the sum of the individual missions of the agencies that make it up. Like other agencies, the Department of Homeland Security should have enough of the people and resources required to carry out its mission. The Director of the National Office for Combating Terrorism and Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security would be charged with domestic security responsibilities. Both should be under civilian control, with the heads of both offices subject to Senate confirmation. We should also remember that future terrorist attacks will affect regions of the country differently. There is no one-type-fits-all strategy. Geographically, distant states like Hawaii and rural areas require different responses and strategies and resources than New York City and Washington, D.C. As we review this legislation, Mr. Chairman, we should consider how it can be most effective while preserving the principles that make America great. I wish to express my appreciation to the witnesses, your patience, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Cook. I appreciate your being here. Congresswoman Tauscher, thank you.
Thank
Good
you,
morning.
Mr. Chairman. I appreciate being before you again. I thank you and Senator Thompson and the committee for having us here. I also thank Senator Graham for his leadership in harmonizing the two bills that we had all been working on. I thank my colleague Jane Harmon for her great leadership on the Intelligence Committee, and I especially thank my colleague Mac Thornberry for his prescience and his foresight a year ago to introduce a House bill to create a Homeland Security Agency.
Would you put Mac up there with Machiavelli, or?
He's our 21st century version.
Oh, maybe that's what Mac is short for. Yeah. Okay.
Actually, I should probably defend him on that. He's a much nicer guy.
He just likes to be called the Prince every once in a while.
I also want to thank Senator Rudman for his help and his friendship and working with us on this issue for so long. Mr. Chairman, I think I'd like to echo the phraseology of the President on another issue, the tragedy in the Middle East, by saying that enough is enough. I think that a long time has passed since the events of September 11th. I think it is time for us to unify the government and to unify the purpose of the American people behind the ability to get something done here. What I am tremendously concerned about is, while there is good work being done here and good work being done at the House, and obviously the President has picked a man of great pedigree in Governor Ridge, who I believe would be unanimously perhaps endorsed by the Senate for a cabinet-level position. Too much time has gone by where we have not done the right thing for the American people to secure their safety. And I think we have to move a bill, both here and in the House, and we have to create a unifying opportunity to do that. And I think this committee's work is going to go a long way to do that. I'm concerned that we get something done on the Senate side and we don't get something done on the House side. And that's going to take the ability of leadership of all of the different parts of the government, all equal but all interested in moving something so that we can produce for the American people a harmonized structure that is practical, commonsensical, that has real accountability, real budget authority, and the ability to do the things that we all know have to get done so there is no repeat of the September 11th, the tragedies. I think it's important that we work together to make sure that we have a robust and muscular department structure that really, I think, is accountable to the American people. And right now, we don't have that. So I thank you for your leadership. I thank my colleagues for working so well. We've got the right bill. We have the ability, I think, to move to compromise. What we really need now is leadership, and we need the White House to support us, the administration to support us. My colleague Jane Harman was very right to say that we can't fritter around the edges here. We can't allow petty differences of power and partisanship and, frankly, committee chairmanships on one side or the other to make these issues less able to move forward. So I look for your leadership continued. I hope that we can do something. I certainly hope we can move a bill in the House if you're successful here, and I hope we get the leadership in the White House to get something done very soon. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you very much, Congressman Thornberry. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you having me back, and members of the committee. I also appreciate the time and effort this committee has put into looking at the issues of organizational reform. It's not very glamorous work. You take this chart that Ms. Harman has and rearrange the boxes. It doesn't just excite a lot of people. And yet, I think it's important. Senator Voinovich is exactly right. It's not a magic answer. We still have to put the money, we still have to have the people, we still have to have the technology to make, for example, border security work. But I think the rest of the story is we can continue to pour money, double, say, Homeland Security budget, and if it's not focused, if it's not integrated, we're not going to get the most out of that money. And organizational reform is very important to making sure that it's focused and it's working the right way. As has been noted, the last 6 months we haven't seen a lot of progress. Governor Ridge has certainly had his hands full. I worry that we're moving towards some sort of a kind of a half-hearted approach, maybe divide INS and take customs and bring it over with the Border Patrol and say we have done what needs to be done, but we will not, in my view. I really think we need to try to get it right. As you know, Ms. Tauscher and I introduced a bill last year based on the Hart-Rudman Commission proposals to create a Department of Homeland Security similar to your and Senator Specter's bill. I think it's important to have that sort of department to bring together these various entities which are fractured all over the government. In addition to the border security piece, it brings together the cyber security as well as emergency response, kind of a beefed up FEMA, and so tries to bring that together. I think it's also important for us to remember, and I'll give him a little build-up before he comes up here, that the Hart-Rudman Commission was a panel of some of the most preeminent Americans dealing with the broad range of the challenges the country faces, and they spent 3 years studying this problem. This is not a knee-jerk reaction to September 11th. This was out way before September 11th, and 3 years of work had gone into it before then. So it is well thought out, and we can study a problem to death, and I think we have to be careful of that. I have some improvements, I think, on my original bill, such as bringing in the agriculture inspectors that Senator Gregg talked about and some others. But I think it's significant that the approach that Ms. Harman has talked about, we feel very confident in bringing those together. As she said, having an orchestra leader to coordinate on a drug czar kind of model the wide range of government responses, but still having a department where the rubber meets the road, can make sure that the Customs Service radios actually work with the Border Patrol radios. And the details of implementing it is critical, but you have to have that direct chain of command and budget authority to make that happen. So I think bringing the two approaches together makes a lot of sense. Mr. Chairman, I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit that I'm familiar with that Machiavelli quote that you mentioned earlier, and I know part of the rest of it. It goes on to talk about how the people who have some stake in the present system only see their interests threatened, and the people who may have a stake in the system to come don't see it as realistic enough to fight for the change. And so what you're left with is getting attacked from all sides. And I think that's what organizational reform often ends up happening. But every day that we fail to take on the turf battles in the executive branch and in the legislative branch, every day that goes by, we have a vulnerability that I think we have an obligation to try to protect. And I think we do have a responsibility to work with the administration, but to move it ahead and not continue to sit around and twiddle our thumbs and say, oh my, when something else happens, because something else will happen. Thanks again for having
Thank you, Congressman Thornberry. Thank you all for your leadership. You have been prescient, and I appreciate the fact that you're working together as we are on this side, and I think we've got to try to move these ideas forward and then engage along the way with the White House as best we can, and hope we can have a good meeting place. But your sense of urgency is just right, and I hope we can conduct our affairs through this committee in exactly that tone. Thank you very much. Wish you a good day. We'll now call the second panel, the Honorable Warren Rudman, co-chair of the U.S. Commission on National Security for the 21st Century, and the Honorable David M. Walker, Controller General of the United States General Accounting Office. I thank both of you for being here. Senator Rudman, as Mr. Thornberry said, the truth is that the proposal from the commission you headed with former Senator Gary Hart is the basis. Your testimony was the basis for the bill that Senator Specter and I put in, and it's put in by our colleagues in the House. And I'm very grateful that you could be here today and reflect with us now, I suppose more than a year after, almost a year after your proposal was first made, and now a little more than a half year after the events of September 11th. Good morning. Thank you.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, Senator Thompson, fellow New Englander, Senator Collins. I'm delighted to be back before this committee again. I spent many hours in this room over a 12-year period, and I'm glad to see it's still in good hands.
Thank you.
Rather than go through a number of points that I had prepared, I think it's fair to say that you all have a pretty good understanding of what the Hart-Rudman Commission did. Certainly you've all been briefed on it. We've had a hearing on it. So rather than do that, I would rather speak very briefly about something that kind of has occurred to me. I purposely got here as early as I could to hear the previous panel and to hear the opening statements, because I wanted to reflect on those statements. And so let me just comment briefly about how I'm viewing this right now and how I think our commission would. There is no question but that the legislation that you introduced earlier this year, that Mac Thornberry introduced after extensive hearings in the House, and that my fellow New Hampshireman, Judd Gregg, talked about this morning, was the single most critical thing that we thought had to be done and could be done in fairly short order. And that was the operational side of it. Now, it is my belief that with a president that has a popularity now of still better than 70%, and a country that is preoccupied with future terrorist attacks, and with good reason, there is no excuse for not going ahead and at least trying to make our borders secure, which is Title I of, I believe, Title I of your bill. And I think you've improved on the recommendations that Hart-Rudman made by including some other aspects of government that properly belong there. Obviously, the entire prevention piece, counterterrorism, the FBI, the CIA, all of the other intelligence agencies will remain where they are, and will have to have a strong link to what you finally do with the border agencies. But there is no reason, if you wanted to go to a zero-based budget today, to put the Coast Guard in the Transportation Department, to put Customs in Treasury, at least their law enforcement function. They're no longer a big revenue raiser, which is why they were there in the first place, or to put the various agencies in justice and also give justice the crisis management responsibility, which they currently have in this government for this kind of an event. Makes no sense, ought to be changed. And for those in those various services that are concerned about their personnel systems, their uniforms, their traditions, we're not saying to change that at all. The Coast Guard will still be the Coast Guard. And that's something that, Senator Collins is concerned about from the state of Maine, with good reason. It will still be the United States Coast Guard. The only difference will be it will report to a Secretary of Homeland Security instead of a Secretary of Transportation. And I want to urge you, and I've talked to my fellow commissioners about the testimony I would give here this morning. I want to urge you that nothing is more important than that. If you cannot guard the border, then you cannot have adequate Homeland Security. Lord only knows, if you walk the Maine border or the New Hampshire border, it's difficult enough to keep it secure with what we have. But to have it in the shambles that it's in, with these agencies not even talking to each other, makes no sense. Let me also add that although we are spending a huge amount of money, parenthetically, I've been asked to testify before appropriations this afternoon, and I took a look at the budget numbers, and they're staggering. What, $36 billion this year, $38 billion next year? And we're spending all this money in airport security, and we probably ought to. Let me submit to you that I think a greater threat right now to the country are the 50,000 containers coming into U.S. ports every single day, less than 1% being inspected, not knowing whether they contain biological, chemical, nuclear devices. I mean, all of our attention is focused on airports, and we're going to get maybe hit someplace else. So when you talk about border security, I don't think there's anything any more important than that. And I would think that in a bipartisan way, it shouldn't be hard to convince the White House that this is in the interest of the country. Now, the second part is more difficult, and that's Title II. And I've looked at it at some length. I've gone back and looked at some of the work that we did over the last 3.5 years, and I asked one of the experts that we had working to look at it, and a group of us looked at it. And let me just read to you a paragraph that we put together. It's a short paragraph looking at Title II. This is not said in a critical way, it's said in a thoughtful way, but I think it will presage some of the problems you may have dealing with the White House and the National Security Council on your Title II. And that's why I wanted to call it to your attention. I think that section, we think, may be a mixed blessing. Surely it puts the Secretary for Homeland Security in the NSC, but it really transforms Ridge's office into a legal executive office of the President entity with a focus on counterterrorism that has some overlap with Homeland Security. People don't understand. There's a little bit of a difference between the two and the way they're defined within the government. Then you create a National Combating Terrorism and Homeland Security Response Council. I think that may add a little confusion because, in essence, many of the suggestions from our commission and others said, either or. Either department-based or executive office of the president-based. You've kind of got both. You've kind of got a foot in each camp, and I think you ought to look at that very closely. I think you fix the operational integration problem in the bill perfectly, but I think you still blur the strategic integration problem. What we proposed was that the National Homeland Security Agency fix the operational issues, and we wanted the secretary or director of that to have membership on the NSC. Once you had that membership of the NSC, then you would integrate the strategic functions with the other agencies. You're doing it very differently. I would strongly recommend that you look hard at that section. I know it's important to Senator Graham. We've talked about it. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm simply saying that it could add some blurring to what has to be a much clearer function of how do you develop the strategy, which is what has been talked about by people here this morning. Finally, I would say that the rest of the bill, you've done a lot of excellent things in it. It's a monumental effort. When your staff delivered it to my office, I couldn't believe it. It was like this. I figured Senator Lieberman was getting paid by the pound lately for his legislation.
I wish.
But I did read it. I read every line of it. I sent it out to our staff people. They looked at it. We think it's a terrific piece of legislation. We think that Title I is absolutely essential. You get that done soon, because there'll be a lot of scapegoating the next time something happens. And it turns out that Organization A had a watch list of their information technology that somehow B didn't have because they were located someplace else. And we have seen it all. We did not make this recommendation lightly. After all, we made this recommendation in 1999. That's the first time we made the recommendation, as Senator Thompson and I discussed the other day, in '99. And now we've got September 11th that came up, this past year, and there's no question time is a-wasting, and I hope you can act on it. If I can answer any questions, I'll be pleased to.
Thanks, Senator Rudman. I guess the highest compliment I can give that is that's what I would call Rudman straight talk. I appreciate it on both points, and I look forward to questioning your position about the focus on border control and access is a very important one, and one I promise you we will consider ourselves. David Walker, thanks as always for being here, and we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Thompson, it's a pleasure to be before the committee again to talk about the important issue of Homeland Security on what is the 7th month anniversary of September 11th. I would ask, Mr. Chairman, if my entire statement could be included in the record, and I will now move to summarize it.
Without objection.
At the request of the committee, Mr. Chairman, I will focus primarily on two issues. One, the need for a statutory base to address the Homeland Security area, and secondly, the status of our efforts to work with the Office of Homeland Security on the many requests that we've received from Congress. GAO, as you know, has done quite a bit of work in the past in the area of Homeland Security, in part based upon our strategic plan that focused on changing security threats in a post-Cold War environment. We had recommended months ago that a statutory Office of Homeland Security be created as a way to institutionalize the important responsibilities that have to be discharged in this area. In my testimony before the Congress this past fall, we noted and applauded the President's effort to establish the Office of Homeland Security, which he could do by executive order. It was the quickest way to be able to respond. But I think now that we've seen several months go by and heard from Senator Rudman and others, I think we clearly recognize that, as the President has articulated, this is a long-term effort which will span years, span administrations, and span individuals, and will involve billions and billions of dollars. And so as a result, I think it's important that we recognize that as to what actions might be necessary to make this effective over the long term and to assure appropriate accountability to the Congress and the American people for positive results-oriented outcomes. GAO has done quite a bit of work over the years demonstrating which type of approaches are more efficient, effective, and economical, and which enhance accountability to the Congress and the American people. Bottom line, there's a clear correlation that to the extent that there is a significant responsibility that spans administrations and years and that involves significant sums of money, that Congress has historically sought to address those with a statutory basis and to head those offices or operations with a presidential appointee subject to Senate confirmation. History has shown that those lead to a more effective and accountable activity. You've also, Mr. Chairman, talked about the possibility of consolidating certain existing governmental operations as a means to improve economy, efficiency, as well as effectiveness and accountability. And clearly in that regard, the border security appears to be the most critical and arguably the most dysfunctional at the present point in time. So in summary, Mr. Chairman, our view is there's clearly a need for a statutory basis to address this area in order to assure effectiveness and assure accountability. With regard to our efforts to work with the Office of Homeland Security, we now have over 60 requests from the Congress, including from this committee, to do important work in the area of Homeland Security. A vast majority of those requests can and we are pursuing to obtain the necessary information from the various departments and agencies. There is, however, certain information which directly correlates to the activities which the President gave to Governor Ridge in his executive order and certain related matters, that we must obtain the information from the Office of Homeland Security. We've been trying for a number of months to work in a constructive fashion with that office. In fairness, they have a big job to do, not enough financial and human resources to get it done, and we are very, very sensitive to the need for them to focus primarily on their mission and not to inappropriately intrude or undercut their ability to get their job done. The bottom line, however, is that to date we have received nothing. However, just within the last 48 hours, I have been informed that the office has decided to engage with GAO, whatever that means. I am, however, hopeful. We have a meeting scheduled for next week, which is our second meeting. The first meeting was attended all by attorneys on the other side, and I have great respect for lawyers, including many here in the room, but I am a student of history, and I know that when meetings start off with nothing but lawyers present on the other side, then sometimes you don't end up where you want to be. But I received a call as recently as yesterday saying that there would be a meeting scheduled for next week that would involve appropriate high-level policy officials, and I just want to...
I suggest you bring Senator Rudman with you to that next meeting.
I think he could be a tremendous help, absolutely. But the fact of the matter is that I think it is important that we receive this information because, after all, Congress counts on GAO for professional, objective, nonpartisan, non-ideological, fair and balanced analysis, and to publish our findings for the entire Congress and as appropriate for the American people. And I'm hopeful we're going to be able to do that with the Office of Homeland Security, and I'm cautiously optimistic based upon the call that I received yesterday that we will be. But we will let you know if we are having continuing problems. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you and others in the Congress to address this important area, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Walker. Please do keep us posted on that. We had sent, or I had sent a letter to Governor Ridge March 19th, just got answers yesterday, and you know, these are the kinds of questions about the functioning of the department that I wish he was here so that we could get more information than is contained in the letter, although the letter is an attempt to respond. Senator Rudman, I want to ask you about the 2 points you made, which are important to me, and the first is, just talk a little bit more. If I understand you correctly, you're saying that, and I remember the original proposal from the Commission had the 3 functions. I may not have the right words, but it was prevent, protect, and respond.
Correct.
Okay. And what you're saying now is that maybe it would be best to, not that the whole idea is still a good idea and the right goal, but there's such urgency about the border, problems at the border, that we ought to take out that prevent part and do it separately, which would leave out some of the critical infrastructure protection and certainly the whole FEMA response, emergency response.
No, I'm sorry, you misunderstood me. I'm saying that our proposal, as amplified by Mac Thornberry and Senator Gregg,
yes,
that ought to be your first priority. That starts to protect the borders.
Right.
Okay. So you take and you create a Department of Homeland Security, which you may recall had FEMA in it, which was also response.
Correct.
It is response.
Absolutely.
You have FEMA in it, and then you have the border protection in it, and a few other things, and you get at least the non-strategic, non-intelligence, non-law enforcement operations consolidated, which you can do. I mean, let's face it, if anybody came up and said, let's put the FBI in the Department of Homeland Security, I mean, you know, nobody would be serious, or the CIA. We know they have to be where they are, but we can certainly take a number of these, and it's outlined in our report, further outlined in, I believe, your own legislation originally, as well as Mac Thornberry's, and so that's the suggestion.
Okay, I got it, because I think Senator Gregg is talking about just, if I'm right, just doing the border control agencies.
Well, he may be. I would add FEMA to that, but certainly the border control is very important. If you're going to go that far, you ought to put the first responders in as well. And if I can make just one point, following up on, so I can clarify one thing.
Please.
You know, the reason we made our recommendation that the Secretary of Homeland Security, or the Director, if you will, have a seat on the National Security Council, is to avoid the very kind of thing that we're facing right now. The Secretary of Defense will come up here about any time you ask him to, and he's a member of the National Security Council. He has an obligation in the United States Congress, the House and the Senate, and its appropriate committees. He is involved in strategy making for U.S. national defense. The problem, as I see it, with what has been created by executive order, and it had to be, it was the only thing they could do, was if you continue to have a non-confirmed person who has substantial either budget authority or budget veto authority over certain sections of the budget, you get it in a real problem with the Congress. I mean, there's going to be a problem. There already is a problem.
That's where we are right now.
That's where we are. And we anticipated that. If you go back and look at the supplements to our work, the reason we suggested that a cabinet-level agency have a cabinet officer who's a member of the NSC, then there is no question but that he is accountable to the NSC and the President, but totally accountable to the Congress on the kind of questions that the GAO is trying to find out about. And that's why we made that suggestion. My comment is, I'm not sure you fix it in Title II.
Yeah.
That's my comment.
Okay, talk a little more about that then, about what you're obviously Title II is in part, as it is in the House now, a blending of two different approaches here. Senator Specter and I focused, inspired by your commission, to do the overall department. Senator Graham and others wanting to just make statutory a coordinating office. So and then our thought is they're not, as reflected in this agreement, they're not inconsistent. So
it is not inconsistent with what you're all trying to do. It is probably inconsistent with my experience working as chairman of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. You may, I don't know if either one of you served on the Intelligence Committee during that time, but there were occasions when we were doing something that was of great interest to the Senate or the House Intelligence Committee. Legal counsel of the White House said, no way can you go up and testify before those committees on the separation of powers. I agreed with that. That was right. So we worked an informal way out of doing it. That was fine. But here, this is much bigger than that. You can't have an informal way to work this out. And I am concerned that if you try to have someone who is really in the executive office of the President, who at the same time is accountable to the Congress, you're going to get a problem. You're going to get a separation of powers problem, and there's going to be a lot of, you're going to have more lawyers than you need, trying to, lawyers instead of people working with the issue. That is why we made the suggestion we made. There is no question that a cabinet secretary is accountable to Congress, no matter what his role in the NSC. That was why we made that suggestion.
Got it.
Now, maybe you can make this work. I don't know, but my sense is the administration will have some problems with this. I do not speak for them, obviously, but knowing how most administrations, Republican and Democrat, feel about separation of powers.
It's a very interesting point you're making, because I think there are some here on the Hill, at least, who feel that maybe the better way to go, better adjective might be the easier way to go, is to make that coordinating office statutory, because it doesn't involve all the bureaucratic head-knocking that is involved in the proposal that we're making. But it does invoke other constitutional and practical political problems.
And I only say, Mr. Chairman and Senator Thompson, I caution you, I think you ought to work those out very carefully, because you've got a terrific piece of legislation here. It is really well thought out. It does need some fine-tuning.
Mr. Walker, do you have an opinion on this question of the...
Mr. Chairman, I think there's two things here. One is the strategy, setting the priorities, determining who has what roles and responsibilities, how the budget is going to be allocated, how do we measure success, coordinating, integrating activities. As this chart showed before, there are many, many players on the field. That, I think, is critically important that it be done by a statutory body headed by a presidential appointee subject to Senate confirmation, because we're talking about years, critically important activities, and billions of dollars. That could be done either through the way that you propose in your legislation, which is a statutory entity affiliated with the White House. I did happen to have a chance to look quickly at Mitch Daniels' testimony. He talks about a possibly ONDCP model to be able to do that type of activity. Then I think you have the separate issue of operational. You know, you're always going to have a lot more entities involved in this ballgame than you're ever going to consider consolidating. But to the extent that you want to consider consolidating some of the more critical, some of the more dysfunctional, whose missions have changed fundamentally over the last 200 years, you know, whether it be the Customs Service, whether it be the Coast Guard, they're fundamentally different in many ways. I think you need to do number one first. If you can do number two at the same point in time, then great. But number one is very critical.
Thanks. Very helpful. My time's up. Senator Thompson?
Excuse me, number one being what?
Number one being is to make sure that whoever is responsible for setting strategy, determining priorities, signing off on resource allocation, determining how you measure success and holding people accountable, that is a statutory entity, may or may not be affiliated with the White House, like ONDCP, headed by presidential appointees subject to Senate confirmation. So you increase the likelihood of that they'll be effective, and secondly, such that you increase the accountability to the Congress and the American people. And then they'll get their own budget as well with that, with both financial and human resources.
It looks like we may be headed toward a situation where we in the Congress do what we have the authority to do, and that is, and only we have the authority to do, and that is to engage in some reorganization, some consolidation. And I could see perhaps that happening without what you refer to as your number one, perhaps. That would be an interesting hybrid kind of a situation. You'd still have say Governor Ridge with the status he's got now, but you would have hopefully more efficient and some consolidated agencies and so forth. Would you all view that as just some improvement over what we've got now, but not really where we need to go? I mean, not far enough?
Well, if you look at national defense strategy today, national defense strategy is established within the National Security Council by the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, obviously the President, the National Security Advisor, but the majority of people that are involved in that are accountable to the Congress. Now, I think what Mr. Walker is saying is that you want a statutory agency that has that responsibility of setting strategy that is somehow statutorily created but in the White House, and I'm not sure an example of that.
Well, let me clarify. I think it's critically important that functionally, whoever is on the point, whoever is in charge, whoever is supposed to be making sure that all these are working effectively together, and signing off on resource allocation, assuring integration, accountability. Wherever they are, whether that be in some entity affiliated with the White House or a Department of Homeland Security, it should be statutorily based. It's headed by a presidential appointee subject to Senate confirmation. Now, under this legislation, you propose two things. One, create something affiliated with the White House that meets those criteria, maybe like ONDCP, and to consolidate a number of other existing operational activities into a new Department of Homeland Security. You could theoretically have that Department of Homeland Security also be responsible for the strategy, also be on the National Security Council, as Senator Rudman is talking about, and you could do it 2 in 1 and just have it in that one. But you properly point out it's going to be a lot more challenging, given all the different institutional interest and the turf, to be able to make that consolidation happen. I think it has a lot of intellectual merit, but if you just consolidate the operations and you don't deal with the strategy, I don't think you've gotten the job done.
You know, if you mentioned a couple of times the Office of the Drug Control Policy. That's an interesting analogy to me, because it looks to me like it's one that both sides are using. On the one hand, you're saying that Governor Ridge is performing a function much like that, so why not make him statutory and why not make him confirmable? On the other hand, others point out that office seems to bear out, the history of that office seems to bear out the point that it has more to do with who has the office at a particular time and the president's interest in that office than it does the nature of the office or the details of its creation. When you had good, strong leadership, you got results, and when you didn't, you didn't.
But Senator, that's true in anything, quite frankly. If you don't have the right leader, no matter what it is, you're not going to get positive results. The concern is that this is a very serious issue which spans years, which involves, billions of dollars. It's got to rise above the individuals involved or the personal relationships.
You make a point in your written testimony. I think is one that I think bears a lot of thought. I've been looking at this. It occurs to me that Congress's big problem is that they want something to oversee. They needed we're supposed to do oversight, and the question is, under the existing arrangement, who do we oversee? 50 departments or parts of 50 departments, and some would say, well, the president ultimately under this arrangement is accountable. The president might decide a little bit later on that perhaps that's not such a good idea, where every problem is brought right to his doorstep because there's no one else there who is accountable, and no entity, no separate entity over which Congress can exercise oversight. That's what you're getting at, I guess.
It is, Senator. In fact, there's one very wise senator, I think it was the Senator Fred Thompson from Tennessee, who one time said, you want to try to avoid approaches that by definition are going to potentially lead to over-lawyering.
Did I say that? That must have been before I decided to leave here.
that there were some issues that were over-lawyered, and I won't go into the details, Senator, and I think that's the risk that we run right now with the Office of Homeland Security. It's not only with regard to testimony, it's also with regard to access to records and other issues that are necessary for Congress to discharge its constitutional responsibilities. I mean, now, frankly, I have some sympathy for Governor Ridge because from a practical standpoint, he's got a job to do, and he can't come up to 10 committees on a recurring basis, and he can't respond to requests from 10 different committees for basically the same information. And I would assert that's one of the roles that GAO can play to help consolidate those things, which is what we have, to try to disseminate the information broadly.
Senator Rudman.
You might recall the original Hart-Rudman proposal still stands to have a strong Homeland Security deputy within the NSC. Now, that would be totally different than Title II here. I would point out to you that in theory, the National Security Advisor is the coordinator of national defense strategy with the Secretary of Defense, the Director of the CIA, Secretary of State, not accountable to Congress, not confirmed by Congress, because when the Congress wants to get at those issues, it has 3 cabinet-level secretaries it can call before it to discuss those very issues. Here, you don't have that yet until you start some consolidation. So, with that confusing answer.
No, that's very helpful. If I could, one more thing, Senator, in your notion of consolidation and Senator Lieberman's bill, would you also recommend integration of those parts of agencies that you're bringing together? In other words, take down all the barriers and just create a totally new entity and call the employees something else?
Probably not in several. The Coast Guard, you would certainly leave as the Coast Guard.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the part you bring into the new entity, the new consolidation.
Well, the new consolidation would, as we proposed it, and it's been broadened by the bills, would be the Coast Guard, the Border Patrol. There were parts of Customs, and I think we also commented on INS, I believe. INS. And we would integrate those to the extent that they have duplicatory functions. The one thing we would do, eliminate a lot of overhead, because you would not have to duplicate all of the human resources, all of the financial, all of the other kinds of controls that each of them have along the way.
You know how difficult even making small, modest organizational changes. Do you think the climate is right now for us to do something this large? Because I've never witnessed anything even close to this being accomplished.
Senator Thompson, Mr. Chairman, let me just tell you, if after what happened on September 11th isn't enough to convince people we've got to secure our borders, I don't know what will be. I will tell you this. I wouldn't want to be holding public office if something like this happens again, and it turns out it happened because somebody slipped across a border that everybody knew wasn't supposed to. And that's exactly the accident that's waiting to happen right now.
Thank you very much.
You are absolutely right, and that sense of urgency in your voice ought to resonate in all of us as we consider these questions, because there is a danger here. Excuse me, there is a danger here that as the days pass from September 11th, our sense of commitment to change the structure to protect Americans at home will become less intense than the institutional inclination to protect turf and avoid change. And you know, what's on the line is just so large. I want to ask you a last question, which is both of you. I was thinking about Senator Redmond first, which it's been about a half year since you were last here on this subject. Governor Ridge had just been appointed. I wonder, and I know you've been busy in your own activities, but as you've been watching his activities from where you've been, has it strengthened your feeling about the Commission's proposal? Has it altered it in any way, to the best of your ability? And I know it's somewhat unfair, but how's he doing, do you think?
I think he's doing very well. In fact, not so long ago, he went down. Gary Hart and General Boyd were invited down to meet with Governor Ridge to give him some of our thoughts. He wants that to be a continuing discussion because we did a lot of the groundwork in this area several years ago before it was even an issue. I think considering the daunting task he has and all of the turf protection going on, I think he's doing very well. I think certainly there are ways to strengthen his role along by some of the things that are recommended. The one thing people have to understand here, and there's been some confusion, Governor Ridge's position and what we're talking about in the Department of Homeland Security are quite separate. They're very separate.
He's actually more like the office created in Senator Graham's bill,
exactly.
Yeah.
Precisely. So they are, you know, people say, well, you know, we don't want to do that because we don't want to give up Governor Ridge's position. They don't understand your bill. They don't understand our proposal.
Correct. And obviously, if we're lucky enough and able enough to adopt a proposal like the one we support, right, it would then naturally be up to the president where he wanted to put Governor Ridge. He might, in fact, make him the Secretary of Homeland Security.
Exactly.
Mr. Walker, do you have any first reactions to the?
I think he's doing his best he can, given a significant responsibility and given some of the challenges that we've talked about here today. I know that they're significantly understaffed. I know that they've got an allocation for about 200 people, and they're just over a little 100 right now. I know that they're having real difficulty in trying to do things on a dotted line basis. You know, there's a fundamental difference between if somebody reports to you and then if somebody, you know, solid line versus dotted line. You know, if you've got an inbox, but you don't have, if you've got an outbox where you can send things out, but not an inbox where people are responsible and accountable to you, that's kind of problematic. My personal view is he could be even more effective if some of the changes that we're talking about today were made. If it was a statutory basis with his own budget, with his own people, with, you know, clear responsibility with regard to what has to be done, with an increased accountability to the Congress and the American people.
Appreciate it very much. Please keep us informed, if you would, Mr. Walker, on your communications with Governor Ridge's office, because it's critically important to us, because you're our eyes and ears and everything else, and for the American people that you're getting the information from that office that you need. Thank you both very much for your continuing service in and out of government.
Thank you.
Take care. Our next witness, Panel 3, the Honorable Mitchell Daniels, Jr., Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Mr. Daniels, good morning.
Hi.
Thanks for being here. We look forward to your testimony now.
The card says I'm honorable. Did you clear that with your colleagues first?
Just done as an exercise of the chairman's prerogative.
Thank you.
But also after extensive fact-finding.
Ready?
Please.
you have my written testimony, and let me just make a few verbal comments to get straight to your questions. We appreciate the opportunity to be here on behalf of the administration for an important hearing that bears on the best way to manage, if not anew, certainly the most dramatically enlarged responsibility of the federal government in quite a long time. A very, very appropriate hearing, and the bills that you're reviewing get at some very important questions. I think as the administration sees it, confronted with the sudden events of September 11th, the President embarked on this project in the only way that made practical sense and tried to get immediately off the mark, and we would assert that this was successful and that in a myriad of ways already, even though there is so much more to do, already the American public, American borders, American infrastructure is better defended by far than it was just 6 or 7 months ago. And for this, certainly the support of the Congress has been absolutely indispensable. As the President has said from the beginning, and Governor Ridge has said, the current arrangement might remain the preference of the administration, or it might change. And the administration is very open to alternative arrangements, and they're being looked at actively as they have been from the outset. The national strategy that Governor Ridge's office is working on will speak to this and may well make recommendations to the President about an evolution of the initial organizational structure. It'll look at clearly the models that are reflected in the bills that you are convened on this morning, your own bill and similar offerings from the House side. And I think we'll all need to examine together the pros and cons of each model. A model that is statutory, but I would say not operational, that is to say non-cabinet, I think may have very substantial shortcomings. I would note for one thing that the size and scope of Homeland Security is already twice that of our National Drug Policy Office. I would note secondly that at least for many that the ONDCP model is not well suited to operational responsibility if it should be decided that should be consolidated. On the other hand, a broader, more fundamental change like that represented in your bill could have many positive attributes. One question we would all have to ask each other is whether the jurisdictional territoriality, both in the executive branch and also here in Congress, makes such an idea practical, whatever its theoretical merits. I would observe in passing that in each of the President's first two budgets, we have suggested very modest here and there transfers of authority to try to rationalize some activities. And those are not always met with enthusiasm, however sensible they may appear. And there's a very important one bearing on Homeland Security, of course, in the 03 budget submission that has to do with consolidating first responder funding in one place at FEMA. We think that's an eminently sensible thing, but we've yet to assure ourselves we can convince a majority of Congress to make that even that modest step. So I know you're well aware of the hurdles that we might mutually face if we went that route. I would just close by saying that one thing that does appear clear is that under any configuration there will always be, now that Homeland Security is so obviously a permanent fixture of the American federal responsibility, it appears clear to us there will always be a need for an advisor in the White House to counsel the President about this very important and multi-agency responsibility. So even if, as might be the case, the administration concluded that new arrangements were in order, I would look for the Office of the Homeland Security Council, I should say, to remain in some form.
Mr. Daniels, thanks very much for both the substance and the tone of your comments, which are quite open and made me think back to a meeting that Senator Thompson and I and several others from the House and Senate were at the White House last fall, shortly after Governor Ridge was chosen with the president, and I believe you were there. And at one point, Governor Ridge said that after some period of time in the office, while they were not for the proposal we were making at that time, well, after some point of time in office, he might come to Congress and ask for some organizational alteration, and your openness to that kind of change is much appreciated. And of course, I agree with you about the practical difficulties here. I mean, I will tell you, and you won't be surprised to hear either, that I've already begun to get calls from people who are clearly calling on behalf of agencies that are consolidated in our proposal, and it's fascinating how many feel like they'd be drawn down by connection with. Everybody feels they'd be drawn down by connection with everybody else. It takes me to the point that my colleagues, both on the committee and who testified on the first panel, made, which is that this is one. It's obviously not a partisan matter. It's a question of what we feel is the best way to get this done, and this critically important job of Homeland Security. And you know, Senator Redmond's typical clarity at the end there. God forbid there's another terrorist attack on the U.S. and it looks like one of the systems that we could have made better was the porous place through which those terrorists came. So we've got to work together together on this. Excuse me. I want to ask you to think. I do not need an answer now, but I would like to propose, just seize the moment if I could, and propose that we think about setting up some kind of informal executive branch, legislative branch working group on this subject. It's really that critical. I don't have any yearning to get into a confrontation on this. I think the best thing to do is see if we can figure out what we can agree on and get it moving, because I think the really fundamental and most important confrontation here ultimately will not be between Republicans and Democrats, and my guess is not between the White House and Congress, but it'll be, if I can put it this way, between those who favor organizational change and those who will resist it. So I hope, I don't know if you want to respond to that at all, but the tone of your testimony evoked that unprepared response from me.
Oh, my instinctive response is very positive. I think that, and I would guess, but I won't presume to speak for him, I would guess Governor Ridge would feel much the same. I think he's trying to reach out in every way he can to make sure that Congress has the information, the understanding, the facts to do its job. And as we try to explore this, the organizational question, I would guess that he'd be open to any sort of arrangement that allows us to get at the right answers more quickly. Time's important here. I know he feels that urgency. I know you do. And I quite agree with you that here, if there's to be a step beyond the current arrangement, there will be an unusual alignment, probably, of proponents and adversaries, and won't be along the typical lines. And there will be a need for advocates of change to, whether it's small in scope or very sweeping, to pull together to persuade others that their own currently vested interests need to take second place.
Good, thanks. We'll continue to talk about that. In that regard, I gather both from some published reports and just general word around, that Governor Ridge, in some sense, is true to what he said might happen when we were at the meeting in the White House last fall, did put forward a significant proposal to reorganize some of the key border agencies into a unified department. But we've also heard that he ran into exactly the kind of turf battles that we've just referred to, and that the Homeland Security Council recently recommended a much more limited proposal, as one of the panelists on the first panel indicated, involving a consolidation of customs and some INS enforcement functions into a border agency within the Justice Department. I wondered whether you participated in the Homeland Security Council discussions on that issue, and if you, to the extent you're able, could reflect on what the objections were to Governor Ridge's proposal and what lessons you or we should draw from that as we go forward.
I am a member of the Homeland Security Council, and I did participate in multiple meetings on that subject. Without breaching the confidence of anyone who participated, I think it's accurate the characterizations are accurate that there have been some reservations and some real practical questions. And I think this is still very much under review. No final recommendation has been made or accepted by the President, and he personally has asked some very tough practical questions, some of which I had not heard asked before. He has a way of doing that. And so I think that the governor's office is still working with agencies who would be affected. I think the other thing to be said is that it's very possible that just as the initial arrangement, as I mentioned, was from the outset described as potentially not the final one, we may have a steady evolution as we all learn more about Homeland Security, where the priorities really are, where the dangers really are, so that I think even if you proceed to legislation successfully, it probably ought to be done in something of a tentative spirit, understanding that it may not be the last stop or the final end state.
Thanks very much. My time's up on this round. Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Daniels, for being here today. When we have these hearings, it forces us to catch up and read and talk to as many people as we can and really focus. And where I come out right now on this is this. The President and the administration should have an opportunity to carry this ball a long way down the field, the way in which it sees best, for a lot of different reasons. And I think that's what the President wants to do. I think it makes some sense. I think analyzing exactly what we need in this country is going to take a longer time than any of us would like to acknowledge. We've waited too long. Senator Rudman's report is just one. You couldn't stack all the GAO reports in this room pointing out the problem that was imminent, that we saw the culmination of on September 11. And just because we haven't acted legislatively doesn't mean nothing's being done. I mean, the Governor Ridge's operation is obviously up and running. They've got a national strategy coming out in July that I think we ought to take a look at before we do much of anything else. And I think a lot of progress is being made in a very tough job that's going to take a long time. But what concerns me as we go along is that we're going to be squabbling and spending time and energy on less important things. Congress is going to continue to feel a need to have some oversight over something. And you can't do that with regard to the President. You can't do that with regard to someone who doesn't come up here every once in a while and tell them what's going on. You've got an entity there that is involved, and a person there who's involved in the most critical issue facing this nation, and heavily involved in spending $35 billion. And we can't forever, it doesn't look to me like, stay where we are right now with regard to that. I mean, Congress has some, I mean, this business about coming up and testifying before all these committees, legitimate concern. And what you might do is challenge us as you address this problem for us to address some of our problems in the dozen committees almost we've got, meddling in these areas. But ultimately, it looks to me like that's the direction that we're headed in. We've been trying to get accountability and do better oversight government-wide for a long time, and I think this is a part of that. And what we're seeing here is just a small part of the problem that we see throughout government that you're well aware of. The whole government needs to be organized. It's not just a matter of Homeland Security that we're outdated in. It's with regard to so many problems facing us. We've got a framework that's geared to a prior century, and it's going to be a monumental task. So it looks to me like the thing that we really need to concentrate on is the reorganization part. And where the boxes might wind up, what needs to be consolidated and all that, that's what we can, and we'll have to spend a lot of time on deciding, but clearly we've got to do a better job there. But that's going to take the efforts. I mean, even a modest effort, you see, it runs into all kinds of problems. I mean, we're the main problem up here. If I were the administration, I would challenge us to let's work together toward reorganizing. And it's going to take the presidential leadership. It's not like something that, Congress come up with something and we'll see. But really have some leadership, decide what you want to do and put the challenge to us to do what we ought to be doing, and that is reorganizing not only these national security related entities, but ourselves. And then, as a part of that, be willing to look at some kind of a setup and entity where we're not squabbling all the time over who's going to testify to whom. Everybody knows that I think eventually, with a position of this importance involving this much money, that we got to, as time moves on, after you've had an opportunity to look at all of this and keep us from rushing into doing something perhaps that we might need to undo later, that somewhere there is where we're going to need to be. So I, as a friend, I suggest that you consider that and take that back and see if we can't in the future concentrate on the real issue and the real problem. We're going to have leadership as long as the president's on top of it, as I know he will be. I think we're going to be fine. As long as Mr. Ridge is on the job, I think we're going to be fine. But we need to get that little sideshow, which is a necessary sideshow. We need to get that off the books and concentrate on what we really need to do, and that is to reorganize ourselves for the long haul in a way that will be there and be workable regardless of who's president or who is the leader in this effort. So I merely suggest that to you, and thank you for your consideration of that.
Thanks, Senator Thompson. Senator Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening these hearings, and welcome to you, Mr. Daniels. Let me ask some questions about the budget, the Homeland Defense efforts, the anti-terrorism efforts, and how do we get a handle on those? Let me read you from the GAO report relative to that. On page 4, we recognize that the Office of Homeland Security has achieved some early results in suggesting a budgetary framework and emphasizing Homeland Security priorities in the President's proposed budget. And this is then what the Comptroller General says. Despite OHS's efforts to date, however, the informal structure and relationship of that office to the White House and other parts of the executive branch may not represent the most effective approach for instituting a permanent entity with sufficient authority to achieve all of the important objectives for securing our borders. Without a statutory framework that clarifies OHS's roles and responsibilities, its budget and resources, and its authority to leverage other federal departments and agencies, the office will likely face persistent obstacles, that's their office, in obtaining fast, effective, and sustainable results. Excuse me, that's the Office of Homeland Security. The office will likely face persistent obstacles in obtaining fast, effective, and sustainable results across the government and throughout the nation. He also has said that they've had access problems, that the Controller General, he says, I must say we've experienced some access problems in connection with our OHS-related efforts. The numbers that we're given on budget are the following from page 5 of his report. Congress's allocation of approximately $60 billion in fiscal 2002, including a $40 billion supplemental request, and the President's request of approximately $38 billion for fiscal year 2003, serve to underscore the importance of the effort that he has described. Are those numbers given to us in one place in the budget with a description of all of the programs and all of the agencies that are involved in totaling up that number? In other words, in the budget that you have submitted to us, I should know the answer to this, but I don't, so I want to lay that as the predicate. Is that a listing of 30 agencies and 200 programs, or what is it?
Yes, the actual number for the 03 submission is $37.7 billion. We think we assert that it's fully accurate. It's because it's built up, and it's built up based on a definition that is certified by the Homeland Security Council. I think that definition is very, very important. It will surely be dynamic over time, possibly like the organization that we're discussing. But it's important that we have one so that people don't succumb to the human temptation to recharacterize less important priorities as inherent in Homeland Security.
And we have a discrete list of how many programs are involved in that?
I'm sorry?
There's a discrete list in the budget of
That's correct.
How many are there? How many programs, approximately?
I'd like to get back to you with that answer so as not to guess incorrectly. I can tell you that...
How about a range?
200.
200 programs, and about
at least
how many?
in terms of line items. I'm answering that based on having rather regularly looked down itemized lists. They're heavily concentrated. 5 departments, by my reckoning, account for 82% of the spending. The big 5 being Defense, interestingly, Justice, HHS, FEMA, and Transportation. But there are already, and undoubtedly there will be more, scores and scores of individual activities.
And could there be how many departments totally might be involved if you look at all of them?
Probably 30.
30, that's the number that we've
like
been
that.
given.
I'll count them for you.
Now, does Governor Ridge submit the, let's assume it's 25 or 30, that's close enough. Does Governor
24
Ridge,
easily.
25 to 40.
Yeah.
Does Governor Ridge provide you with the budget request for all those programs, or do they come in from the separate departments?
Let me speak to this a little because I think it relates back to some important things you said earlier in your statement and that the GAO report speaks to. Before you arrived, my opening comment, I reiterated that the administration remains very open on the question of what the eventual organization for Homeland Security ought to look like. Maybe the arrangement we have today, but possibly some evolution of it. One problem that was forecast at the beginning that I would claim has not occurred at all was the ability to, I think you said the authority to lever resources. There's plenty yet to be done, and there certainly have been some obstacles and some places where it's been difficult to move quickly. But one thing that I think has worked pretty well so far is that the governor, as the president's advisor on this subject, in his office, where they have identified needs, have secured them either in the supplemental requests we've made or in the budget proposal we've made for '03. And he has spoken to this many times himself. He's said, in essence, or literally, anything he's asked for, he's gotten. This was the President's guidance, and we have implemented that using the offices of OMB. So the answer to your question about budgets is that we took the definition, what is Homeland Security, placed it in front of the agencies, invited all their suggestions. These were then screened by Governor Ridge's office, staffed in part by the outstanding professionals that I work with at OMB. And he then recommended to the President and certified to the President the adequacy of the requests we've made to date.
That the process now is that you get from 30 to 40 departments requests. He screens them, decides whether or not he recommends them and to what extent he recommends them, and certifies that they're all necessary pursuant to the criteria in the description of Homeland Defense.
I should probably also say I think it's increasingly the governor and his office are initiating and guiding agencies in terms of what is needed. This was not always like a usual budget exercise, a matter of subtraction. There have been a number of areas, and I know there'll be many more, in which the governor will be initiating and recommending activity that may or may not have been contemplated by an agency at the time.
Well, it's very clear that his role then is not only significant but growing. And we need to know here, it seems to me, where those recommendations come from, who's responsible for making them, whether or not more has been requested than has been provided, who's accountable for the funds once they are provided. And he is so clearly in the center of it. It seems to me that it is very difficult for us, and more important for the public, to have a handle on where they go for funding. Do they go to Governor Ridge's office to urge that there be a program in the next year's budget? Do they go to one of 40 agencies to urge that? And they're then referred to Governor Ridge saying, well, gee, if he really wanted it, he would have initiated it. Go see Ridge. Ridge then says, well, wait, go see that department. They're the ones that really administer those funds. It's too mushy from the public accountability's perspective. It's not clear. The accountability's not clear. The authority's not clear. And I must say, I don't see any way offhand of clarifying all those things without doing as the GAO has recommended, which is to provide a statutory authority for that office. I don't see how we're going to accomplish those important aims without doing that. But my time is up, and it's all right. I think maybe we ought to allow a response.
You may well be right, Senator. Once again, I think the whole matter of the best organizational form is still very much under study. I would say that Homeland Security won't be different from any other government activity I can think of in terms of its mushiness and the multiplicity of parties who get in the act. We frequently get advice from the public through congressional offices, for example, about what ought to be spent, so people know to visit various windows to make their case. But I think under the current arrangement, Governor Ridge should be seen, and is seen by most people, his office is, as the central place for advising on the big questions we face now. What should the national strategy for Homeland Security comprise? What are the biggest threats? What should be met? Which should be met first, and so forth? And I think they're doing a great job of rationalizing all that, working with the departments. And
thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Senator Levin. I don't have any further questions. I just make a final comment, which is listening to your Senator Levin asked a series of questions that I was going to ask if he did not. And the answers I find to be encouraging, but also leading in a different direction, which is encouraging in that I'm glad Governor Ridge is playing that central role with OMB in separating out all the the requests that are coming in for funding for Homeland Security. And your point about defining exactly what is Homeland Security is a very important point. I heard somewhere that there may have been over a couple of $100 billion in requests that actually came into you.
That's correct.
Right. And you got it down to $37.7 billion, which in itself, of course, is a considerable number. Very important that Governor Ridge was right there with you, and by your testimony now, ultimately had the final say insofar as he's certified to them. But it also clearly shows that he's more than just another advisor to the president, that he's exercising the kind of authority that I would want someone to exercise who has responsibility for Homeland Security, and clearly it makes at least 2 points to me. One is that we need to give him the statutory authority to, if I can, legitimize or put into law the powers that he's actually, and quite correctly, exercising. And two, it leads me also to make an appeal to the administration through you to figure out a way that he can testify before committees of Congress. This is one of those cases, we've been quoting Machiavelli all morning. I don't have a Machiavelli quote here, but we've all been in situations where in public and in private, where we've taken a position and then it gets carried down the road to a point where even we begin to doubt it or wonder about its logical consistency, but we certainly are not going to say we made a mistake. And at least I own up to saying that I've done that. And it seems here we got to a point where when Governor Ridge was offered to this committee, the Appropriations Committee, to do a public briefing, but wouldn't come to testify at a public hearing, there's not much difference. And we ought to figure out how to, there's a practical problem, which I think we can work on together, which is we don't want him being called up to every committee of Congress, every day. We want him to have the time to do his job. That we can figure out. So I hope we can, while we're working on legislation, also work our way through the tussle that's going on about whether he testifies, because it is fundamental to the accountability of a person who's exercising quite correctly the kind of authority he's exercising.
Well, I think the administration does too, Senator, and I think you characterize it accurately. The governor is doing all he can, and he's open to additional ideas about ways to inform and enable the Congress to do its job. At last count, he's had 40 now meetings, and more are scheduled, open, closed, and otherwise, everything other than formal testimony. This doesn't count the 100+ formal appearances that individual cabinet members have made. All that I think separates the viewpoints at this point is really an honest difference about a principle that of long standing about presidential advisors testifying, and I know he remains very flexible about trying to achieve the end you're looking at under the while trying not to walk away from that principle.
I appreciate that, and obviously my point is I think he's now happily and correctly necessarily more than an advisor. Thanks very much for being here. Appreciate your testimony very much. I look forward to continuing cooperative work on this important matter. We'll now call the fourth panel. Dr. Philip Anderson, Senior Fellow and Director, Homeland Security Initiative, Center for Strategic and International Studies. I.M. Dessler, Center for International and Security Studies, School of Public Affairs, University of Maryland. Stephen M. Gross, the Chair of the Border Trade Alliance. Dr. Elaine Kamark, John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, and Paul C. Light, Vice President and Director of the Governmental Studies Program at the Brookings Institute. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks for your patience. I think it's been a very interesting morning so far, and I'm sure it'll only continue in that productive way with this distinguished panel. Dr. Anderson, why don't you begin?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Senator Thompson. It's an honor to be here this morning to present my views on the proposed legislation. Let me say that my statement represents my views alone and should not be considered the institutional perspective of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. There's a description of, in my written testimony of the projects that CSIS has been involved in both prior to and since the tragic events of September 11th. In my view, in this new and very dangerous environment, the proposed legislation, if enacted, would greatly simplify management processes and unify the efforts of the 46 federal agencies that to varying degrees have responsibility for Homeland Security. Effective communication and coordination among these disparate agencies is extremely complicated, and in the absence of organizational reform will only become more difficult in the years ahead. With responsibility spread across so many agencies, it is equally difficult to ensure that no duplication of effort exists between organizational visions, and with the additional requirement for the federal government to coordinate and communicate efforts with state and local governments, and further, to develop the means to work with and cooperate with the private sector, it is clear that some organizational reform must be initiated to ensure unity of effort. The most important question to consider at this juncture is when to initiate organizational reform. Some would argue that there is no time to waste and that well-informed decisions should be acted on immediately in this environment. There are two problems associated with the desire to act now. First, an ongoing crisis may not be the best time to initiate organizational reform. With nearly every aspect of the national security apparatus focused on the war on terrorism, such broad-reaching change at this point in time could be an unwelcome distraction. Second, and more importantly, in the absence of a comprehensive national Homeland Security strategy, there can be no clear understanding of the threat to be addressed or any real sense of priorities from which specific requirements will emerge. It would seem that to organize in the absence of a strategy would be putting the proverbial cart before the horse. The strategy should serve as the basis to initiate organizational reform and allocate resources rather than the other way around. Several things to consider. First, a comprehensive national strategy should serve as the basis for organizing the federal government for Homeland Security. Organizational reform at any time will not be easy, but will be far more difficult in the absence of a strategy. Without a strategy, no framework exists to base decisions about how to organize the government and spend the taxpayers' money. In addition, most agencies of government that are focused on Homeland Security have other primary missions that will have to be accounted for. For example, the Customs Service has a primary mission as a revenue-generating agency focused on goods and trade, not on security. Last year, the Customs Service collected $23.5 billion in taxes, fees, and penalties, second only to the Internal Revenue Agency in generating government income. Second, a comprehensive threat assessment should serve as the basis for the national strategy. While we remain extremely vulnerable in many areas, most do not represent critical vulnerabilities simply because they are not likely targets. How many would argue at this point that commercial aviation is a critical vulnerability? On the other hand, private aviation with 500,000 private pilots, 200,000 private aircraft operating from approximately 18,000 airfields throughout the country could certainly represent a critical vulnerability. Some would argue that the nuclear power industry is critically vulnerable. I would submit that the nuclear power industry, the most regulated in the United States, is far less vulnerable than other aspects of energy infrastructure, to include liquid natural gas operations, refineries, and petrochemical facilities. But the bottom line is that without an informed assessment of how those that would do us harm might act, the ability to organize and allocate resources effectively is extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. Another important point relates to the way in which the current organization of government looks at the threat. FEMA is a good example, with an organizational culture that has, for the most part, addressed natural disasters rather than a thinking enemy. Third, the means to create public-private partnership must be developed to ensure adequate security of critical infrastructure, and this is critically important. The private sector remains ultimately responsible for securing the infrastructure it owns and operates. This responsibility is complicated by the requirement to generate profits for stockholders and to provide customers with affordable service. Clearly, the federal government should share the burden for critical infrastructure protection, but while the government cannot always step in and assume full responsibility for critical infrastructure, it must find ways to incentivize the private sector. It's essential that the private sector should be included in the development of the National Homeland Security Strategy and in its implementation. The strategy and the organizational construct that derives from it must simplify the communication and coordination problem between government and the private sector. A good example of this problem can be seen in the containerized shipping industry. Approximately 7.5 million containers enter the United States each year, and the contents of these containers originate with approximately 450,000 shippers. This clearly represents an unworkable number, but an interesting statistic is that the contents of 60% of the containers that enter the United States originate with about 1,000 shippers globally. And this would seem to be a workable number where public-private partnership might be able to make a difference. The bottom line is that any organizational reform must formally address the requirement for public-private partnership. Again, Mr. Chairman, in my view, over the long term, in this new and very dangerous environment, organizational reform such as that described in the proposed legislation must be initiated to ensure unity of effort and clear lines of authority, responsibility, and most importantly, accountability. Assigning the bulk of responsibility to a cabinet secretary and a White House directorate, the way it is described in the proposed legislation, would seem to represent a much improved process for ensuring accountability, rather than the current situation where responsibility is shared across 46 agencies of government, where ensuring accountability is virtually impossible. The most important question, again, to consider at this point is not whether to initiate organizational reform, but when to initiate organizational reform. Assuming the administration can produce a comprehensive strategy this year, and once it's published, the debate can begin on implementation. And that will certainly involve the appropriate organization for Homeland Security so that every aspect of government can move forward together in a unified and coordinated way to fully address what is surely the most complex problem our government has ever had to face. Mr. Chairman, the road ahead remains complex and fraught with challenges yet to be addressed. I thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. The Center for Strategic and International Studies is ready and willing to help. Organizing effectively to secure the American homeland is essential to our country's survival and prosperity. We appreciate the committee's leadership on this issue, and we look forward to helping in any way we can.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. It strikes me that we go from Dr. Anderson of the CSIS to Dr. Dessler of the CISS. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Thompson. We very much appreciate the opportunity to present our views on organizing for Homeland Security. I say we because this is a statement jointly with my colleague Ivo Dalder of the Brookings Institution, who was here earlier but could not stay for the entire hearing. We're grateful for the work that you and Senator Thompson and your committee and staff have been devoting to this urgent issue, beginning, I think, really days and weeks after September 11th, and perhaps even before that to some degree. We're all in a situation where we've got an unprecedented challenge. We're trying to listen and learn, even as we try to give our best views. And so I will state very directly the views that Ivo and I have developed at this point, but we realize that this is something in which we all ought to be learning and maybe a change. Basically, our judgment of the bill is that it is an ambitious bill. It contains many desirable features. At the same time, we think maybe it goes too far in some directions and not far enough on others. Let me be specific. We agree with this committee that the current U.S. government organization for Homeland Security needs to be strengthened. But rather than seek a new department or a new White House office, we believe Congress should build upon what the Bush administration has established. Specifically, we favor legislation that would make the Homeland Security Council and office statutory entities with their director confirmable by the Senate. Legislation that would enhance the Homeland Security Director's budget authority, and legislation that would establish an independent federal border agency, including a broad range of current units responsible for monitoring people and goods entering the United States. The main reason why we think a Department of Homeland Security cannot be the main organizational response is that it cannot include more than a fraction of the agencies and functions involved. Many players, the Department of Defense, Justice, Health, and Human Services, to take the largest, will necessarily remain outside of this department, not to mention the FBI and the intelligence community. Hence, the predominant need will be effective coordination of separate organizational entities. The draft legislation acknowledges this fact, but its cure, at least under current circumstances, could be worse than the disease, because you would create both a Secretary for Homeland Security and a Director of a National Office for Combating Terrorism, with attendant confusion as to which one was, in fact, the leading federal official on this vital issue, and making the two co-chairs of a council charged with overseeing implementation of the national strategy seems to us a recipe with low probability of success and high probability of confusion or conflict. But we agree that the Homeland Security structure needs to be strengthened. The basic organization developed by the Bush administration is, I think, sound because coordination is the overriding problem. But its credibility has come into question due to Governor Ridge's unwillingness or inability to fight and win some of the tough organizational battles. We believe that his power and the power of the organization would be enhanced by giving the Homeland Security Office, Council, and Director statutory and budgetary authority. As presidential advisor confirmed by the Senate, Ridge would gain greater stature in general and would also, by definition, have much greater ability to work effectively with the Congress. We do not think the parallels are perfect between this and the National Security Advisor and the National Economic Advisor. We think there is a greater need in this case for this official to be working directly with the Congress. We do believe that in providing such authority, Congress should eschew any desire to micro-organize and pass a clean bill, or at least a relatively clean bill, using the language of the President's executive order. To strengthen the Director's influence over Homeland Security and the Homeland Security budget, we strongly support the provision in Senator Lieberman's bill, which I understand will be co-sponsored by Senators Graham and Specter, sorry, that would give the Director power to certify or decertify agency budgets comparable to the power currently exercised by the drug czar. In addition, we would integrate the Homeland Security budgetary effort more formally with the presidential budget process run by OMB, as we understand it has been integrated this year, by designating the Chief Office of Homeland Security budget person as the OMB Associate Director responsible for Homeland Security. It would also, as suggested by Senator Thompson, be of enormous benefit if Congress could do more to create its own focal points. Ideally, it would be nice if appropriations subcommittees for Homeland Security could be established. Finally, we support creation of a federal border agency, such as recommended in Senator Gregg's legislation, incorporating the Customs Service, the Coast Guard, the INS enforcement arm, the Agricultural Inspection Agency, and perhaps also the newly created Transportation Security Agency, and possibly the Consular Affairs Bureau in state and the entire INS, including its service division. The administration's current proposal folding Customs and the Border Patrol into a subunit within Justice seems to us to fall well short of what is needed. The agency needs to be both larger and independent of any other cabinet official. Border security is clearly an area where we believe organizational consolidation can make a major contribution to securing our homeland. Thank you very much. We have your response.
Thank you, Mr. Desta, very much. Mr. Gross, appreciate your presence here. You bring a unique perspective, and we look forward to hearing it now.
Thank you very much. Chairman Lieberman, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the committee, good morning. My name is Stephen Gross. I want to thank you for this opportunity to testify this morning on the proposed realignment of federal agencies that is so important to Homeland Security. I have submitted a longer written statement for the record. I am the president and owner of Border Trade Services in San Diego, California. We are a cross-border warehousing and logistics company employing over 100 people in San Diego, California and Tijuana, Mexico. But what brings me here today is my position as the 2002 chairman of the Border Trade Alliance, the BTA. The BTA is a grassroots organization that was founded in 1986 as a group of individuals, entities, and businesses that conduct legitimate cross-border business in the NAFTA marketplace. As such, we have a unique perspective on the security challenges facing our land borders. Representing a group that lives and works in border communities, I bring to you today firsthand experience in interacting on a daily basis with the federal agencies posted along our borders, namely the U.S. Customs Service, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the Border Patrol. The events of September 11th presented all of us with challenges, the likes of which we had never contemplated before. But our organization is hopeful that these terrible events have presented our nation an opportunity to improve the way we approach security, and that includes examining how the resources of our borders can be better managed to enhance our physical and economic security. Senators, our land border security and trade facilitation is severely lacking. The various Federal Inspection Service agencies posted along the U.S.-Mexico and U.S.-Canada borders are charged with poorly defined and sometimes conflicting missions. Oftentimes, our ports of entry are home to petty squabbles over turf and resources and fall victim to mismanagement. The land border ports are not home to business best practices. At each port of entry, Customs and INS personnel are operating with different missions, despite that fact that Customs and INS are cross-trained in the primary inspection lanes. The INS or Customs employee at the port of entry receives incentives to carry out the individual mission of his or her employing agency. There is no incentive to work together or speed legitimate trade and cargo through our ports of entry. Despite recent talks in this post-September 11th environment of improving lines of communication at the highest levels in INS and Customs, we rarely see the same spirit of cooperation employed at the ports of entry themselves where it is needed most. Because of these reasons, we view Senator Lieberman's legislation with great interest. We believe that Senator Lieberman's bill would go far in decreasing government costs and increasing efficiency by placing both Border Patrol and Customs under the same agency head. Realignment of this sort would improve border security by removing a layer of bureaucracy between the ports of entry and the coordinator of all security efforts. Realignment would put one entity in charge, a cabinet-level secretary overseeing the Department of National Homeland Security. We believe that, among other things, agency realignment would establish accountability for border inspection in a single agency, eliminate overlap and duplication of efforts, prevent the development of redundant support systems, facilitate and streamline the processing of legitimate trade and travel, improve enforcement of laws at our border. We do have some concerns with this bill, however. Our organization always believed that increased security at our borders need not to be achieved at the expense of trade facilitation. Indeed, we believe that the two are one and the same. With the proper resources, our Federal Inspection Service agencies can quickly weed out those individuals who would seek to do us harm while processing legitimate trade and travelers with a reduction, or at the very least, no increase in the time the cargo or traveler is spent waiting at the port of entry. With that said, we want to be sure that any new emphasis on security does not hamper legitimate trade and travel, which is so vital to our economy. Second, we recommend that all enforcement functions of INS, not just the Border Patrol, be transferred to this new agency. Our hope is to put an end to turf battles at the ports of entry and have everyone committed to the same goal. We fear that only shifting Border Patrol to the Department of National Homeland Security and not the other enforcement functions of INS will perpetuate these problems and leave our border security strategy without proper coordination. Third, while it may seem trivial, we do have some concerns about the message the Department of National Homeland Security conveys to our trade partners, especially our NAFTA neighbors, Canada and Mexico. Perhaps a name along the lines of Department of National Homeland and Economic Security would more accurately convey that ours is a nation still open to the world markets. There are other proposals for agency realignment circulating on Capitol Hill, and we welcome the opportunity to comment on them as well. We are supportive of any effort that will secure our borders and facilitate the passage of legitimate trade and travel. We do, however, advise that any transfer of INS enforcement functions and Customs not end up in the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice does not have a proven track record in consulting with private industry on a regular basis, and we fear that maintaining our country's strong trade position will not be a priority in such an organization. Improving security at our land borders is a worthy and necessary goal, not only to ensure our physical safety, but also to preserve our economic security. The World Trade Center was targeted on 9/11 because those two towers were powerful symbols of our nation's presence in the global marketplace and our strong domestic economy. As a result of implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, trade between the U.S. and Canada grown enormously, and all signs indicate that this trade will continue to grow. There are some that say now is not the time to take on an initiative as bold as that outlined in your bill. They say things are getting better, and the agencies responsible for border management are working together now more than ever. We disagree, and best answer those claims with a question. What is so great about today's situation at the borders that it's worth preserving? To what point will things have to deteriorate before we look at making a bold change? We also want to ensure the committee and the public that we have little interest in creating another large bureaucracy in Washington that the trade community will have to wrestle with. If anything, we view the proposals contained in this bill as a way to streamline communication between industry and regulators by creating a one-stop shop on cross-border issues. In conclusion, no amount of reorganization is going to result in better border management without a commitment from Congress to provide agencies with the tools they need to keep trade flowing and make our borders more secure. But now more than ever is the time to start looking at significant realignment of agencies posted at the border. If real security and trade efficiency are to be achieved, we must take the first step by consolidating the agencies under one leadership structure. It may take years to change the internal cultures at the individual agencies, but without this first step, our goals will never be achieved. This is a matter of national survival and economic security. Looking ahead, we believe that ultimately we're going to have to look seriously at consolidating all agencies with enforcement duties at the land, border, ports of entry into one agency with responsibilities solely for border administration. This bill is a good first step. Finally, we do not make these recommendations lightly, and we know that the type of changes we are discussing here will not completely insulate us from outside threats or be the ultimate solution for our ports of entry. But years of living and working in border communities and in and around ports of entry have brought us to the same conclusion. Bold changes are needed if our national security and economic security are to be preserved. On behalf of the Border Trade Alliance, I want to thank you again for listening to my comments here today. I will do my best to answer any questions you may have, as well as seek an effective way to organize our government for Homeland Security. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Gross. Interesting testimony. Dr. Kmark,
Hi.
welcome.
Thank you very much.
Nice to see you. I was tempted to say, and I will say that in your work in the last administration, you probably earned the public servant's equivalent of a Medal of Honor for efforts to reorganize the government. So you have an experienced perspective that you bring to this new challenge. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Senator, and nice to see you, Senator Thompson. Let me start by saying something that I think summarizes what we heard this morning, and I just want to point this out. Homeland defense is not going to happen in the White House. It's not going to happen in a Security Council, a coordinating council. It won't happen in the cabinet room. Ask any American who needs to know when there's a threat. Some guy who's in the White House or a $45,000 a year employee who is guarding the border, and they're going to say it's the latter. And I think the real importance of this bill, which you should be commended for, is to tackle the problem of the border, which, as we've heard before, has been long ignored. Let me point out that these problems of the border are not new. But until September 11th, there was never the sense of urgency to overcome all the bureaucratic intransigence to this. I would make two friendly suggestions to this bill. I would consider including the Department of Consular Affairs at the State Department in here. Currently, that department is extremely overworked and understaffed. It tends to be manned by young diplomats who are trained in diplomacy, not trained in law enforcement. They do not have access to real-time intelligence, which they need. And in fact, as Mary Ryan has testified before the Senate, they had no relationship with the CIA or the FBI on a regular basis before September 11th. I do hope they do now.
And these are just explain for the record what these folks do.
Consular affairs officers hand out visas. They are our first line of defense at the border. They're generally young people, first diplomatic post, who are stationed, say, in Beijing. Sometimes they have to see thousands and thousands of people a month, and they have no training in law enforcement. They have no training in trying to figure out, nor do they have the intelligence access that they need. So I think this is worth including here.
Just for the record, I hate to give you some extra time, but I don't remember every case, but of the 19 hijacker terrorists who brought the planes in the attacks on September 11th, almost all of those came in exactly that was their first point of contact.
Of course, their first point of contact for coming to the United States is getting a visa. That's the first point of contact. So if you're going to talk about really securing the border, you do have to start there. There were actually, of these, by the way, there were 2 potential hijackers who did not get visas to come to the United States. So something was working, but obviously not enough. The failures of the INS, I do not need to recount here, but let me just say they are not new. During the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979, the INS could only track down 9,000 of the 50,000 Iranian students who were in the United States. And here we are, many, many years later, more than 20 years later, this has not been satisfied. Customs has, as we've heard, an enormous role in our economic well-being of this country. And therefore, if you pass nothing else out of this bill, I would urge you to pass the Acceleration Fund for Research and Development of Homeland Security Technologies, because it's very clear that in order to keep our trade in good shape and our economy in good shape and simultaneously increase our level of security, we're going to need some substantial new investments in technology. And I think, boy, if you could start that right away, it would be great. And finally, I would make another suggestion to take the newly federalized airline security force out of the Transportation Department and include it along with the Coast Guard and the other groups in this new agency. There's absolutely no difference between guarding a land border in terms of what you're looking for in security and guarding an international airport. And I think that if you put these together, you have some real very good synergies and the potential for some very good reorganization. 2 quick points. On cybersecurity, I think it's a wonderful example of putting some things together. I will say, however, that both for your new cybersecurity agency and for the new Homeland Defense Agency, do not use the current civil service law. Write into this bill its own authority to create a new personnel system, or quick pass Senator Voinovich's civil service reform bill. I mean, the worst thing we could do would be to create a new agency and then saddle it with a civil service system that more than 50% of the federal government has already gotten themselves out of because they find it doesn't work for their needs. And then finally, on the National Office for Combating Terrorism, I'm very skeptical that having worked in the White House for 5 years, closely with all these agencies in the White House, I just don't think Congress can ever legislate the internal workings of the executive branch. I just think it's not a good thing to spend your time on, particularly when there's so many other things in this bill that are so important. The way this sets up, it conflicts with the Office of OMB, it conflicts with NSC. I do not think it's good to create a kind of dual budget process within the White House when, after all, you have to have one budget, the president's budget, for clarity. So that portion of the bill, I would say, all the other things that are so important in the bill, I would urge that you concentrate on those, particularly on the border questions and the cybersecurity questions, which our government is very, very, very far behind on, and leave it to each president to figure out how they organize their own White House. Senator, I think that if there had been a little difference in those ballots in Florida a year ago, you might have been on the other side on this one. Thank you very much.
Oh, you make such overwhelming sense in all that you say. Thanks, Mr. Light. Thanks for being here.
It's a delight to be here. I was actually sitting up behind you, not you, but Senator Glenn and Senator Roth in 1988 when the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee last created a cabinet department. We elevated the Veterans Administration to cabinet status, and I don't raise that memory to remind you of what a wonderful job we did. I don't know that it improved the performance of VA. I was also behind, sitting over to your left when we created the Deputy Director of OMB for Management, a Senate-confirmed position that we hoped would give greater attention and visibility to this important job, and now it is mid-April. The administration, in a vast, rapid dash to the finish line, has yet to submit a nominee for that critical post. It's with that kind of sense of sort of the limits of reorganization that I get the last word on this panel and in this hearing, I suppose. I've heard 2 things today. Number one is that organization matters. That's a nice thing to hear. before the Governmental Affairs Committee. Every once in a while, people in Congress and in this town recognize that organization matters to program effectiveness. Our temptation here in town is always to tinker, to exhort, to work with the current system as best we can, to adopt the least common denominator approach. I'm telling you, this is a time for a chainsaw on the organizational chart of government, and not just at INS and not just for Homeland Security. We've got an organization chart that is an utter nightmare, a mess. We've got bill after bill introduced in Congress to realign, reorganize. I think we've all come to the conclusion that organization matters, and it's a very nice thing given that that's what I do for a living. Not that I would say that the elevation of the Veterans Administration suggests that I did it well, or that we did it well. Number two, I think important before this committee is that accountability matters. That's what we're talking about today. Everybody talks about efficiencies and who reports to whom, but you know what? At the end of the day, if you're an Article I person like I am, you believe that Senate confirmation matters, and that being able to call a significant player in the administration to testify matters. I think Governor Ridge should be called to testify. I think that he is enough like the director of OMB, enough like the drug czar, enough like the international trade rep to be called to testify. I don't see a problem with that. I see all the maneuvering about getting a situation under which he might step into these hallowed halls and sit down before you and give you a public briefing, but he controls a lot of money. He is at a point now where his success, in a sense, confirms the notion that he should be confirmed and invited to testify. On your legislation, I believe that the rationale for creating a department exists. I think there's plenty of history to demonstrate. I mean, we've created cabinet departments on the basis of many arguments. They all exist here, actually. We can look at the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation, HUD. We can look at education, HEW, the Department of Defense. We created them with the same instinct that's on the table here. And let me say that you don't have to include every last piece of a policy area in order to create a department. That is just not a requirement of past cabinet building. If we did that, we'd have exactly one cabinet department in the federal government. That's how we would get everything under the same tent. Secondly, I believe that statutory authority for the Homeland Security Director, Tom Ridge, or whomever it is the sine qua non of accountability. I think it should be done. Thirdly, I argue in my testimony that the organization chart is a mess, that we have a moment here before us where we ought to take that long look at the organization chart of government, take a look at food safety, take a look at bioterrorism, take a look at Homeland Security, take a look at intelligence services, take a look at them in a systematic fashion by enacting a bill that's been pending before this committee for 12 years and is now under the title of the Government in the 21st Century Act. I think we ought to take this look. It can be done quickly. It can be reported back to Congress within a 12-month period, even less. I think if we're going to do a reorganization, let's do it well, and let's do it in a fashion that forces Congress to deal with it up or down through some sort of a forced decision mechanism that would require a military base closing type of decision. I guess that is the last word.
It's a good word. We're going to ask you a few questions, but thanks, Mr. Light. And it's reassuring to know that there are a few Article I people out there. I appreciate it very much. Mr. Gross, let me ask you if you could, from your experience, to share an anecdote or two with us so we can get a feel, because very few of us, maybe none of us, have actually been at the borders to the extent that you have, trying to move goods, particularly back and forth.
Sure, and I invite you with that opening to come to the border, come to San Diego. The problem is when we have people at your stature come to the border, the agencies know you're coming, so they have their best hat on. They open up all the lines. There's never a problem because they know you're coming. We need you to come undercover. Not know you're coming, put a Machiavellian disguise on you, and we'll show you what really happens on a day-to-day basis going on down there. But, you know, the anecdotes are many. I mean, you read about some in the press that I think that are probably more accurate than others, but from a passenger side, mismanagement, half the lanes are never open. In San Diego, as an example, we have land ports. We don't have bridges, so we have infrastructure to be able to get people across more efficiently with with better management. In Otay Mesa, as an example, there's 14 lines at the border, at the passenger side. Never more than 5 or 6 are open. Half staffed by Customs, half staffed by INS. They have a 50-50 responsibility at the primary lanes. Their management has to talk together with each other to make the passenger side efficient. There's never proper coordination. Again, I think the INS guy, because of his training, is more looking for the illegal immigrant coming through, where the Customs guy is looking for the contraband coming through. So there's not total cross-training on what they're looking for when they're processing people.
Yeah, I heard, somebody told me the other day, it was actually one of my superb staff members, that there's some indication that people are trying to break the system, know by the uniform who's going to be looking for what. And
I've heard that before, because you can't tell them. They have distinct uniforms. Right, that
are to bring contraband.
They'll want to find an INS line versus a Customs line.
And then
Sure. And I wouldn't doubt that would be the case. I mean, these are very sophisticated people that are doing bad deeds at the border. If it's drugs or if it's illegal immigrants, there's big money involved, and they're very sophisticated. They will find a way around the system. If there's a breakdown in the system at the border, they're going to find it.
I take it, you said this, I believe, or suggested it anyway in your testimony, that the press, that you would find what the press is reporting, which is that Governor Ridge's original proposal for consolidation of the border agencies has now been reduced to the point of putting the Border Patrol and Customs in the Justice Department not to be enough.
Yes, we think the Justice Department is not, again, from my testimony, not the right department. We have seen at our borders, mismanagement issues. I mean, we've seen it. It's been well documented about problems with the Justice Department and INS. We have seen, in my opinion, and I'll give you this. Let me state this is my opinion, that at least where I'm involved, Customs does a much better job of management at the ports than INS does. Mm-hmm. That's going out on a bold statement. I'm going to hear from, okay. I'm sure, but that's my opinion.
I'd rather say it, so your boldness has been echoed. Dr. Kmark, did you want to add something on that?
Yeah, can I add that? I mean, that was very troubling to me when I heard that they were going to put this in the Justice Department. From being in a White House, I know exactly what's going on, right? They're saying, oh, well, we like Secretary X, and he's kind of a superstar, and so let's just give it to him. That would be such a terrible mistake. It would undermine, if even a piece of this bill ended up in Justice, it would really undermine it, because what would happen, the secretaries never manage these things, right? You're talking layers down, and layers down in the Justice Department is exactly where these INS problems are. So if any version of this ends up in Justice, you run a significant risk that the flawed management structure that has run INS now for several decades would in fact be then running a new agency. Customs has a much better track record in reform, in using technology, et cetera, and so I would heartily say, boy, that would put it in Customs, and if you have to do that, but keep it away from the Justice Department.
How do you react to Senator Gregg's proposal, which is to say to create a separate, if I understood him correctly, a separate border agency in lieu of the overall, in lieu of both the smaller step that seems to be coming along in the administration and the larger agency that we've proposed?
I think that would still help, but I think that it's better to go the route you've proposed, because I think it gives it more clout, it's more inclusive, you would get more synergies from the technology. Forget cross-training, everyone would be trained in one area. And there's a huge problem facing this entire thing, which is the economic problem. And I don't think that a sort of subsidiary Border Patrol agency would have the ability to get what it needed from Congress, et cetera. So I think you're right in making it a Homeland Security agency, whatever, a cabinet level agency.
Mr. Destin.
I just wanted to emphasize to generalize a point that Elaine made on the border security. All of these units that are being brought in are not or haven't been before September 11th priority units in their departments. I mean, the Coast Guard is not the prime business of the Department of Transportation. The Customs Service is not the prime business of Treasury. INS is not the prime business of Justice, et cetera. They've been essentially, the cabinet members don't pay attention to them. They haven't. They pay some attention to them now because Homeland Security is such a big thing. But if one really wants a focus, if one really, there is not a strong argument based on function for them remaining where they are in virtually all cases. Transportation security is slightly different in that it's new, and obviously the Secretary of Transportation is paying enormous attention to it, and they seem to be doing fairly well. But there is a real tension between having security in an agency whose main job is the promotion of transportation. So we also think it makes sense to put that in a border agency as well.
Mr. Light.
I'm spending a lot of time right now looking at the Transportation Security Administration. And I'll tell you something, you move that agency right now at this particular moment in time and you set it back 12 to 18 months.
Why?
It is just such a hard job. They have some momentum now. They are setting up policies and procedures. The Deputy Secretary is completely and totally engaged in making that TSA a reality. I just think if you move it someplace else, you lose that momentum. You just do. I mean, just finding the office space and getting the hiring criteria in place. I just think 12, 18 months from now, maybe. But right now, it would disrupt motion, I think, very seriously.
A final question. What about the law enforcement functions of the Immigration and Naturalization Service? Some have suggested they be brought into this agency. Others have said that they shouldn't be separated out from other functions in the INS. Any opinions on that?
I think the naturalization functions should definitely be kept in the Justice Department. I think they're fundamentally different, and even the administration even has a bill that would simply do that. I think that then you have to look carefully at the enforcement functions, their relationship to the border, their relationship to security. My guess is probably most of them should go into this new agency, but I don't have a real firm opinion on that, except to say naturalization should definitely stay in Justice.
Yeah, Mr. Gross.
I think I'd agree with the doctor on that. The enforcement agencies, we believe strongly, should be part of this new agency, any enforcement agency, and they should have the same law enforcement status. You know, one of the practical problems that we've seen at the border is, and I think it's documented, is one of the problems is the resource they're not able to recruit new Border Patrol agents and new INS agents quickly enough, and there's a lot of looking around for these people. Once they get hired and trained, which takes 6 to 12 months, they're jumping to other, where they can get law enforcement status, better pay, better benefits. They're jumping to the Customs Service. Half of them jumped the Sky Marshal program as soon as, because it was a much better status for them. So now they're having to rehire again. So the retention, which is a big problem with these agencies, because they're even though they're all working on the border, they're at different pay scales and they're at different levels, and that's another big problem we have at the ports of entry.
May I add a word? I mean,
yes.
I think if ever there were a reason for taking a chainsaw to an agency, INS presents it. You must divide that agency. I mean, the question to you is, how's it doing where it currently is?
Yeah.
Right.
How well is that agency running? You've got to do something radical to INS in order to give it the wake-up call. I just think that's one where the argument is quite different from TSA. This is one where this agency just is going nowhere unless you do something radical.
I think there's a lot of sentiment here on the Hill that agrees with you. We'll see what about INS, see what happens and how quickly. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to get back to ask some of you what you think about a couple of comments that Dr. Dessler made. First, having to do with getting a strategy first. You know, we're talking about where what department goes where, what agency rather goes where, how the boxes should be rearranged. We're never going to get a consensus on that for sure, and we don't need to endlessly debate this, but on the other hand, we've got supposedly a strategy document coming out, I think in July. Do we, and I know the GAO says that it took the Drug Control Office 10 years to come up with a national strategy. Now, we're not going to wait 10 years, hopefully, or anything close to that. But that just goes to show how difficult it is deciding really what we need to do. I mean, we're looking at kind of at all of government. We ought to be looking at all of government. We got 45, 50 different entities out there, agencies, whatnot, participating in all this. Do we know enough to decide at this point exactly where the boxes ought to go, or how we need to reorganize, and how significant will this comprehensive national strategy that the administration is putting together be in that? Kmart, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. I do think that Tom Ridge's role should not be operational. I do not believe White House offices are ever effective if they are operational. I think there's, in fact, a long history of White House disasters when they try to be operational. Ridge's office should be, and I think they're doing this, should be developing a strategy that is comprehensive, because even the provisions in this bill are only a small piece of what needs to happen overall in the government. We haven't even talked about CDC reform or any of the other pieces. However,
intelligence, as you
intelligence
in your statement,
reform
which is a
huge.
key part.
Right, key part. However, I do think that when things like this happen, there is a coalescence around government problems that everybody has known about for a long time. And that's why I think you hear so much unanimity in here about the border. In other words, before September 11th, people made the same criticisms of the border problem as they're making now. Now we have, however, a much more important reason to pursue those. So while I agree with the need for a national strategy, I do think there are pieces of this that people who've been in government a long time and studied it are ready to go forward with, and hopefully in July a Border Patrol agency will be part of this national strategy, but hopefully there'll be a lot of other things, including some intelligence agency reform too.
And perhaps we need to take advantage, frankly, of the political momentum that we ought to be having right now. I mean, I assume that the worst national disaster we've ever had will not be sufficient enough to reorganize government. I mean, it's going to take something more than that, Mr. Light, I assume. But as you point out, there are some things that we can do that we've known for a long time. It's just a matter of attention and momentum, which perhaps we have now that we haven't had before, and we can do some things if we can't do everything. Another kind of a corollary to that, I guess, is a question having to do with the fact that regardless of what kind of entity we come up with, it seems that some very important parts are going to be left out. They're not going to be under the tent, and intelligence comes to mind. Everything gets back to that, and we know how deficient we are there, and how much better we have to do. And we have to figure out how we communicate, how the FBI counterintelligence, for example, the CIA communicates with these entities. They don't like to talk to anybody, even among themselves. And so now we're asking them to figure out a way to communicate with governmental entities that have nothing to do traditionally with these other problems. So how significant is it? I mean, one could make the case because of that, perhaps we ought to just fall back and have this entity just be a coordinator. How significant a problem is it, if you see it a problem, that if we create something new, a very important part of the picture is necessarily going to be left out? Did you want to elaborate further on that?
Our sense is that certain things are moving. They may not be perfect. The Homeland Security Council is not perfect, but Ridge is moving. He's got a head of steam. He's got a mandate. He's had a budget role. He does have an interagency process working. And so the logical thing to do right now is to support that and to, I think, resist what I think is the wrong-headed administration desire not to have a congressional communication, not to have a congressional role, but not try to sort of change, not write right away anyway change the form of that. I think it's not perfect. There's some signs he's losing battles, but I think he could be reinforced by this committee in some of these issues. We also believe that when you look at something like the border, you have functions that by their logic seem to belong together. They have the same purpose. And as Elaine suggested, you have a history of problems. And so there just seems to be a very strong sense for pulling these together. Now, you get into gray areas. For example, in most of the Homeland Security Department bills, including yours and including the Hart-Rudman recommendations, they include FEMA in this organization. We would not include FEMA because we're thinking they're basically doing something. It's obviously very important, but it's basically something different. Now, somebody might do a study here and prove us wrong. They might prove that there are important synergies for putting that together with the border agencies, say. But our sense from looking at it is that you try to look for groupings that make sense to pull together. And the border agency is a particularly clear case where just the current location of these places is only, in a sense, either historical or because you had to have a cabinet department for them. Coast Guard has bounced around in various places, and so transportation is as comfortable a place as any for a good agency. That.
Does anyone else have any comment on that? I guess finally, I especially took note of your comment about research and development, K-Mark. That seems to be the first place people cut.
I know,
and the most. Is that your experience?
That is my experience. First place people cut is the development side, and we cannot solve this problem without that. We can't solve this problem at the border without significant new technology. People are talking about, biometrics and all of this stuff. Well, we can't, we're facing this sort of terrible choice. We can make our borders really secure and stop all trade. Right? Nobody wants to do that. So the technology is the only answer to that. So that's why I said in my written testimony in here is, if you do nothing else, I'd do that first and try to get some of that technology in development and in testing, et cetera, so that we can improve the situation.
Some of these agencies are still filling out forms by hand.
Well, INS is that going back to my comment about why you can't put this in justice. INS has a history of not being able to implement technology that you guys in Congress have given them and funded.
That's a government-wide problem, as you probably know too. We have an abysmal record. We wasted billions of dollars trying to integrate information technology into these various departments. IRS is a classic example, but they're constantly high profile. INS has not been that high profile up until recently.
May I add a last word of encouragement?
You're actually going to get the last word.
If you look back at the 1988 Department of Veterans Affairs Act, you'll see that the final title in the act, as a price of passage by this committee and by the Senate, that bill came over from the House, was the creation of a comprehensive look at the overall organization of government. It was enacted by the Senate, it was enacted by the House, and signed by the President. It carried a trigger that allowed the
next president
to do away with it. And our colleague, Elaine, one of Elaine's colleagues, Dick Darman, among the very first decisions he made as budget director was, no way am I going to have such a thing on my watch. If we had done such a thing on his watch, I'll tell you something, we'd have the roadmap right now that we need to do exactly what this committee wants to do. Maybe that's the last title, maybe that's the fourth title of this legislation.
Nice suggestion to end on. I thank you all. You've been both in your written testimony and in your oral testimony response to the questions. You've been very helpful. This has been, I think, a constructive hearing, and I've learned from it, and I have a renewed sense of urgency that we should go to markup as quickly as we can, get done what we can, because this is an urgent problem every day, and then try to meet up with the administration and actually provide for better Homeland Security. Thank you very much. We'll keep the record of the hearing open for a week in case you want to add any comments. Members want to ask you questions. I would ask each of you, because you bring extraordinary experience and knowledge here, to stay tuned to what we're doing, and I invite your comments and responses and suggestions as we go on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hearing's adjourned.
Thank you.
Probably did survive.
Thanks, Fred.
Good
This week, C-SPAN's American Writers Series continues to look at our country's history.